Landlords. Who are your tenants from hell? When I was a little kid, my parents bought a cheap house in a neighboring town and fixed it up to rent. 2 young women moved in and they were great. Just out of college, working entry level and kind of getting by, no trouble. They called at 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve because there was a spider. My dad called back when we got home from church service and asked them what they wanted him to do. They said they wanted him to kill it. So he went out on Christmas Eve to kill their spider. They seemed to think that this was normal, like about on par with what you'd expect your landlord to do if your water pipes burst on Christmas Eve. It was the least he could do given the situation. It's not a tenant from hell story by any stretch, but it does make me laugh. He told me that I wasn't allowed to move out until I could kill my own spiders, because screw that. Oh, I have a couple of tenant from hell stories. In 2007, an older couple decided to quit paying their rent. But they had pretty good excuses, so I didn't evict them until after 3 months of not paying. Finally went down to the courthouse to file an unlawful detainer on them. We finally had our day in court. The female, who was usually dressed nicely with fake nails and an expensive weave, showed up looking like an old hag. The guy was using a walker, which made me eye roll. This mother fricker didn't need one. And they claimed I was a slumlord and never fixed anything, but I had receipts from every repair, including a new AC unit. After I got the judgment against them, I tried to garnish the man's wages. They'd told me he worked for the Coca-Cola company. Turns out that company had never heard of him, but after a little digging I found out they'd both been arrested for selling something with a very similar name, but in a white powdery form. The officer showed me mugshots dating back to the early 80s. On their way out, they also stole the refrigerator. And then there was this past summer. I had a family of 7 move into a 5-bedroom house. They paid their deposit and the first month's rent. That's it. Haven't seen another dime from them. To top it off, they didn't get the power switched to their name, so I got more than a $400 power bill. About a month ago, I called the water company. Turns out they never had the water turned on, so they've been stealing water too. The water company pulled the meter. I'll be the one paying to have it put back. When I gave a 24-hour notice to do a walkthrough with police present, the woman answered the door and told me, "You can't come in and we'll get out when you follow all the procedures and the sheriff kicks us out." You know, I think they've done this before. Oh boy, that second group is hard for me to villainize, to be honest, because they were likely quite desperate to be resorting to back-to-back squatting with that many kids. Still, and I can't believe I'm saying this, you can't blame the landlord for kicking them out. Yes, I'm doing this video to try and get the perspective from the other side, and yes, in regular life I still err on siding with the tenants when there's any doubt. My dad owns quite a few apartment buildings throughout Colorado. One summer while I was in college, he was between managers for one of his 80-unit properties, so I acted as the stand-in manager until he hired a new one. I can't say she was the worst tenant per se, but I definitely have a few stories surrounding one woman who we'll call Kate. One day we were served a notice that Kate was taking us to the small claims court. Why? Because her in-unit washing machine wasn't working. Had she reported the problem to management? No. The maintenance man and I entered the unit that afternoon to fix the washing machine. What was the problem, you ask? It was unplugged. In the same summer, my dad woke me up at 2 a.m. saying the local police department is at the apartment on a shots fired report. When I arrive at the place, it's lit up like Christmas with squad cars. There must have been like 20 officers at the scene. What prompted the call? Kate and her bimbo friend were walking back from bars hammered. They heard 2 loud pops and decided someone was firing at them. What had actually happened? 2 guys launched a bottle rocket from a nearby balcony. Also worth noting that this happened on the 4th of July. The unit that Kate lived in was townhouse style, with the first floor consisting of 1 car garage and a staircase leading up to the living area. My dad's manager was posting a few available units on Craigslist when they happened upon another curious posting. Kate had posted the garage for rent on Craigslist under the premise that somebody could live in the garage, and they'd be able to come upstairs to use the kitchen and restroom. The manager immediately marched over there to notify Kate that her posting violated the lease, which specified no subletting, and the Colorado Housing Code, which specifies a maximum occupancy of 2 people per bedroom plus 1. Kate lived in a bedroom with her husband and child. Kate was unable to comprehend what the manager was saying. She just kept repeating, "But think of all the extra money we could make each month." My dad said she couldn't simply wrap her head around the fact that her idea would be violating a legally binding agreement and the state housing code. They had to get her husband involved to have her remove the post. Kate called us on Christmas Eve one year complaining that the heat wouldn't turn on. My dad's a good guy and doesn't mess around with things like tenants being without heat, so he immediately got up from the holiday dinner with extended family to go and fix her problem. What was the issue? The breaker for the HVAC system was flipped. Some other entertaining stories from when I was growing up. When I was young, my dad owned 3 duplexes in a row. One winter, around 1995 I believe, he noticed that the energy bill for one of the units was exorbitantly higher than the other units. He was curious about their energy consumption and paid a visit to the property one day while the tenant was at work. I clarified with my dad about this, and he did give the tenant notice 24 hours prior that he was coming to perform an annual check of the fire alarms. He entered the basement and stumbled upon hydroponics galore. He said that there were over 30 green herb plants, each with their own UV lamp and watering system. While that particular herb is legal in Colorado now, it certainly wasn't back in '95. He told the tenant that he'd be entering the basement in 2 days with a maintenance man to perform routine boiler maintenance. When he returned in 2 days, the plants and hydroponics system were gone. Growing up, my dad always told me that you could identify a grow house from a mile away because it was the only house on the block that didn't have snow on its roof. He also leased 2 or 3 units from that 80-unit apartment to the local Mormon church. The idea was that the church would house their missionaries in my dad's units while they completed their mission. As a result, the apartment inhabitants would rotate every year or so. Well, one rotation, my dad had a particularly un-Mormon batch of Mormon missionaries. This batch threw rages so loud that the noise could be heard 4 buildings away. They were also known to frequent the local escort services and associated substance scene. As you may imagine, my dad had quite the uphill battle to fight when it came to addressing the missionaries' extracurricular indiscretions with the Mormon church. I do believe he eventually did successfully evict them, though. He's also buddies with one of the local mailmen. Whenever he has a tenant that screws him over by trashing their apartment or moving out in the middle of the night, the mailman will tell my dad their new address. My dad gives the mailman a gift certificate for a steak restaurant and a nice bottle of whiskey for Christmas every year. They've had this arrangement for about 10 years. This happened to my friend's rental. This one tenant gets evicted, and instead of trashing the place, they cut off chunks of drywall, put dead fish in the walls, and seal it all back up. The tenant was a carpenter. The owners couldn't figure out the smell for weeks. They repainted, got it professionally cleaned a few times, and searched endlessly. Eventually, they figured something died in the walls and started knocking holes in them. Turned out to be that piece of crap move by the tenant. I had a tenant remove the kitchen island and bring it outside by the pool because they needed an outdoor serving area. The narrator couldn't find confirmation of what material said island was made of or how extensive the work was to get it outside, because that's potentially a whole ton of work just to move outside a mostly wooden island that would get destroyed by the weather. These tenants are more stupid than malicious, though. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I have a crazy, manipulative tenant. She looks after the place well, but I wonder if my psychological damage is worth it. Early on in the tenancy, she complained about the shower curtain sticking to her. It's a shower over bath setup, and since she pays her rent reliably and keeps the place clean, we thought, oh okay, what the hell, and we paid to have a glass screen put in. We specifically instructed that the glass screen go in front of the shower head, as any sane person would, and after it's installed, I get a complaint from her about how she has to turn the shower head 45 degrees to stop the water hitting the ground. I go to inspect and find that the glass is inexplicably at the other end of the bath. Turns out she had insisted that the installer ignore our instructions and put it there for whatever fricking reason I don't know. I told her that since she had countermanded our instructions on something we were paying for, that it was now a permanent fixture in our property, that she was lucky we didn't charge her for it, and that she was going to have to live with the setup she had insisted on. She asked if she could put a cat flap in the back door. We agreed on the provision that she pay for it herself. See, we're learning. We also insisted that it be a proper cat flap, not some home dodgy version. She puts in a rubber cat flap door, which I personally wouldn't have gone with, but whatever, she's happy, so we let it go. Little did we know what that was leading towards. After the first winter in the house, she emails us copies of her electrical bills and says that the house needs better heating because her bills are too high. Looking at the bills, we agree that the house must need better heating, and we invest in a 7-kilowatt Daikin split system. She tries to tell us where to put it, and we tell her that the installers have designated this one spot as the most effective, and that we're not open to alternatives. We instruct the installers to refuse to shift the unit, see, we're still learning, unless they deem it to be superior because she's not paying for the damn thing, we are. After the installation, the installer says to us, "Hey, just to let you know, the reason her bills are so high last year is that she pulled the cat flap into the open position and left it hooked up that way all winter. She created a deliberate hole between the inside and outside and left it fully open for an entire season and then complained that her heating wasn't effective, all so that she could score an expensive new heater that wasn't required." At this point I started thinking, is she really that manipulative? Would anyone deliberately freeze themselves just to make me fork out thousands of dollars for new heating? Is it really that important to her to screw me over for no purpose? Surely not. Surely not. Next, she asked permission to get a dog. We said yes. She then told us she had purchased a puppy and it would be ready in 3 months, but oh hey, that side fence needs replacing or else he'll get out. The fence probably would have needed replacing within 7 or so years anyway, so we figure, okay, that's probably not entirely unreasonable, and we agree. We're not keen on the way she's manipulated things by getting us to agree to a pet and then using that to pressure us, but we take the attitude that if we get the fencing job over with now, it's done and won't be a problem later. Then she says that the neighbors are substance users, and so she wants the fence extended down the driveway to stop them hovering near her car. We see her point, the neighbors are definitely criminals and constantly in trouble with the police. So fair enough, we think, and say that we'll be looking into doing that as well. Then the neighbors were evicted a few days later, hurrah! And social services put the house up for sale. We put the fence on hold until the sale goes through. A nice bloke buys the house and starts renovating it for his family. Great guy. We replaced the fence at our expense and he helped with the labor. However, we're not learning fast enough. In fact, we're total fricking idiots because it seems that now she's not getting that dog after all. The dog ploy was sufficient to get the fence replaced, and now there's no dog necessary. She has a shiny new fence, but she's not happy. No, she wants that fence extension put in. But, we point out, the new guy is a quiet family man and no threat to anyone. There's no need for a fence extension, so we'll not be putting one in. You have a brand new fence, be happy. She is not happy. She sends me a text about a week later saying that she really needs the fence extension put in because, and I quote, "the police are all over and there's dead bodies in the street." As you can imagine, I'm floored by this. Aside from the now long-evicted ferals, the house is in a nice street mostly populated by retirees. It's not by a long stretch any kind of ghetto. I ring the new neighbor to confirm and he says that no, there's no police anywhere and that street is, as usual, quiet. He questions whether perhaps my tenant is schizophrenic. God knows. Maybe. I think it's more likely she's just compulsively manipulative because she's got a very clear endgame in all of this, and she's showing remarkable dedication to coming up with complete bullcrap to achieve it. But anyway, back to the police in the streets and dead bodies everywhere issue. Turns out there was an accidental carbon monoxide death of 2 people on a boat moored at the nearby bay, and police were attending the accident. No crime, nothing but a tragedy a couple of blocks away, which was being attended to very respectfully by the authorities. I tell her that no fence extension is going to be forthcoming. End of story. Or so I think. A few weeks later, she tells me that she needs the fence extension because the neighbor's gate keeps swinging into her driveway and hitting her car. I pop around to speak with the neighbor because God knows I don't trust a single word that comes out of the tenant's mouth, and while I'm there, he demonstrates that, lo, the gate cannot in any way enter her driveway, even in a gale, even if he swung it really hard. It can't enter here or there, it can't enter anywhere on her property, because the gate is inset from the end of the fence, and there's literally no way for it to swing past that point. At this stage, I told her through gritted teeth that I've spoken with the neighbor and that her car is safe from his gate. In the 3 years she's been with us, she hasn't had a rental increase, and she's always paid substantially under the market rate, because it was more important to me to get someone who looked after the property than to get the best price for it. However, I think the very next time that I get some made-up psychotic bullcrap from her that's designed to manipulate me into yet another expensive and unnecessary upgrade, her rent is going to suddenly go up to market rates. If I have to put up with any more of her crap, by gosh, she's going to start paying for it. And if it means that she moves on and I take my chances with a new person, then so be it. I've already checked with the tenancy tribunal here, and I could put up the rent by $50 a week to match the market rate without them so much as blinking. And that's just to make it market comparable with the houses that don't have new fences and expensive heating. She's gone radio silent for a few months now. I hope that maybe she's finally worked out that she's on a ridiculously sweet deal and should quit while she's massively ahead. Okay, so that, my friends, is what it looks like when one tenant has enough issues to fill up nearly a third of our video's runtime. Ridiculously patient landlord. I thought I'd forever be on the side of tenants in these kinds of situations, but it just goes to show that some landlords really do go through hell just trying to be decent managers. My mum had some tenants in a rental property who apparently were serial crap sacks and would live in a place until they got evicted, then move on to the next place. They'd do things like not pay rent while claiming the AC was broken or some other property-related issue, and then avoid actually letting it be examined or fixed. Long story short, after getting evicted, they waited until the very last minute to move out, left a bunch of their stuff behind, and filled a microwave with hot dogs which they left to rot. While my mum was in the process of getting a court order, the TV show Hot Bench, a Judge Judy spin-off, called and asked them to come on. Everyone got flown out to LA and my mum got her money and the crapsacks got berated on national daytime TV. So I suppose it worked out in the end. A tenant rented an apartment that didn't come with a parking space. An apartment in the building that did come with a parking space became available. He asked if he could have it. I told him it would be an extra amount per month, and he then started posting propaganda all over the property about the injustices that I supposedly committed for not giving him a parking space for free. He tried to get other tenants to sign a petition that would make me give up my parking space on the property. He then took us to court. He lost, but not without just a freaking nightmare of his crap personality and sociopathic tendencies. The most annoying aspect of it all was the fact that he was this bullcrap hippie dude who was all about peace and positive vibes and teaching yoga and stuff. Wrong him though, and he was the most toxic human being you'll ever meet. I used to have a job that involved cleaning and minor repairs of rental apartments and houses between tenants. Usually it was easy enough, but the ones who were evicted often made it a point to wreck the place on the way out. One particular jerk decided to pack plumber's putty into the sink and bathtub drains and then turn the taps on before he left. They had to get professional contractors to fix most of it, but I got to rip out a bunch of stinky wet carpet and water-damaged floorboards. My parents had some tenants when I was probably 7 or 8 that never paid the rent, and they wound up getting evicted. My parents decided that they'd save some money and we'd just clean the place up ourselves. This was their worst idea ever. I didn't know what a lot of the stuff I saw that day was until much later in life. The first thing I saw when we walked in the door was a fish tank full of dead exotic fishies. In the bedroom, we found used bedroom protection, sanitary products, and needles, like just lying around. Once we saw that bedroom, my parents gave up and hired a professional cleaner, but I heard what else they found. They found a cat shoved into the toilet of the master bathroom. It was terrible. I used to work in lettings. We had a young couple move into a house. They were young and were using benefits to pay their rent, but the landlord wanted to give them a chance. 2 months later, we got a call from a locksmith contracted by the police. The police had raided the house the night before because the young man was a dealer. They had literally smashed the front door frame out of the wall, and the locksmith had been called in to make good. We called the girl. The young man was in police custody and she couldn't afford the rent and wanted out of both the tenancy and the relationship. We made a house visit to check the state of the door. It was pretty bad. They had a dog in a house with a no pets policy and it had been shut in a bedroom a lot. Turds and chew marks and scratch marks everywhere. They'd smoked a bunch, we had a no smoking policy, and the house stunk of stale cigarettes. The landlord agreed to let them out of the tenancy and get the house back on the market. It cost thousands to put the house right. New front door, redecorate, all new carpets. It was just about ready to advertise when we had a call from the neighbor. There had been a disturbance the night before and he'd had to call the cops. The young man, being released from police custody and unable to get back with his girlfriend, had broken back into the property a couple of days earlier to squat. He'd then had a visit from his supplier he owed a lot of money to. His supplier ended up attacking him. He almost bled to death on the brand new cream carpets. Once we'd got more new carpets in and fixed the broken window from where he'd broken in, we found a new, reputable tenant. A nice young man who was actually a substance counselor, which turned out to be good because a lot of the local users didn't get the memo about their dealer being arrested and then attacked. So he had a lot of visitors in the beginning and knew how to deal with them. There was also a single mum with some pretty serious issues who tried to burn the house down. Luckily, they all got out alive and she got help. And finally, another guy threatened to attack me because he owed rent and couldn't pay, and I made him feel guilty. He got a visit from the cops, what with me knowing where he lived and all. But my favorite story was the tenants who lost their postbox key. The landlord posted them a new one. 2-bedroom unit rented to 2 girls, grown women mind you, with jobs. They complained that there were roaches. The previous tenant had had no roach problems. We'd even cleaned it and seen none. So we get it taken care of, and they still complained they were there. Now, we're thinking she or her roommate brought them. Skip to them both leaving on October 31st. We get the key and check the unit. It's trashed. They left behind a bunch of bottles on the counter, glasses, plates, cutlery, clothes, shoes, food just all over the place, and roaches. Lots of roaches. We called the junk removers. They don't remove unless it's roach-free. So we called pest control. They advised to remove things before they do their jobs. Frick my life. My parents have owned properties for a while, so there's a number, but the one that I'm personally invested in is the last tenant. They decided to rent out my childhood home, and I suggested it to a coworker. I'd worked with this woman for several years and thought she and her family were decent people. I trusted them. They brought bed bugs into the place, did quite a bit of damage to the walls, and also pulled out and sold the 100-year-old hardwood trim. They removed the central air unit and sold it, and just generally messed the place up. They then proceeded to skip town after being kicked out once they found out that their wages were being garnished. Show up to your court dates, kids. Having tenants leave behind a pile of trash, horrifying bathrooms, and holes in the walls is common, but I hold a bit of a grudge on this one specifically.
Fellow teachers of Reddit, what experience have you had with dumb parents? I substituted in a high school for 5 months to finish off the year for a teacher who was on maternity leave. So I had a student, high school senior, who never did any homework, accounted for 35% of the total grade. I would constantly send emails to the parents who always responded that they'd deal with it. Spoke with the parents at conferences and kept the admin in the loop. 1 week before finals, I sent the notice home that she needed to get a 97 on the final to pass the class and get the credits she needed for graduation. And I even gave her one more chance to turn in past homework for 50% credit. Fast forward to the final, she barely gets a passing grade and therefore can't get the credits, can't graduate, can't enlist in the Air Force like she had intended. The parents come into the office of the school screaming at everyone that they had no clue it would come to this. When we all sat down in the office with the guidance counselor, principal, department head, and myself, I reviewed the several notices with them, explained that she had multiple opportunities to gain credit, etc., but refused to do anything. Turns out the wife was hiding the emails and information from her husband and wanted her daughter to fail so she wouldn't join the Air Force and move away from home. Last I heard from the situation, they're not together, the daughter is working at Lowe's, never finished high school, and has 2 kids and multiple arrests for selling drugs. There's a reason I didn't want to pursue teaching as a career after that. We had a parent instigate an investigation into bullying, formal complaint, restorative meetings, etc. because her son was on the playground after school, and one of the older children wanted to get past him and said, "Excuse me, little one." She said that by not using his name, the older child didn't know it, he was bullying her son. I taught English in Colombia for a summer and had some pretty interesting interactions. One particular set of parents insisted that their son was a brilliant genius who didn't need to study. He rarely came to class and therefore could barely speak any English, while the rest of his classmates could speak full basic sentences. I emailed his parents my concerns for his apparent lack of motivation, and they told me that he could speak perfect English and didn't need to come to class, so they let him skip. Finally, parent-instructor conferences time came and I asked them to bring their son. I asked him in English, "How's English class coming along?" He stared blankly and just started crying. Told you so. Just before Christmas break, I had the students hand in a paper. One of the students was missing a page, so I pulled out the contact sheet that I had the students fill out at the beginning of the year and gave a call. The student's father picked up the line and said, "Thanks for calling. We'll definitely get that extra page into you." The next day, the student's mother comes storming into the classroom. She happens to be an education assistant at the school. She demands to know where I got that number. I said her son had put it on the contact sheet. Apparently, the parents are separated. She proceeded to tell me that I had no right to call that number, and that when there's a problem with her son, only she has the right to know. I told her, thanks, that's good to know. That's when she dropped this bombshell. "If he hands in something that's incomplete, you fail him. You got that? Fail." Then she walked out of the classroom. This coming from a person who's supposed to help children succeed. I wouldn't actually call them dumb parents, but parents who are in denial about who their child actually is break my heart. For instance, we had a student who had an abundance of markers for autism and was in 6th grade. All the teachers on the student's team agreed they ought to tell the parents their concerns and suggest the student be tested so we could offer more resources for the student. The teacher who spoke with them was very polite and very kind in suggesting they try and figure out how best to help the student. And the mom literally screamed at her that nothing is wrong with her child and that she would never get the student tested. Her husband even tried to tell her that it wasn't a bad thing and they should try and see if it would help, since his teachers who knew him thought it might. The mom started cussing out the teacher and stormed out. I teach in a college, so the students are almost always 18 or over. A couple years ago, one student's mother called the chair of my department to complain on behalf of her daughter about the difficulty of some of the work listed on my syllabus. My chair was baffled and asked the mother if her daughter was over 18. The mother replied that her daughter was 20 years old. My chair explained that it was then her daughter's responsibility to either speak with me directly or withdraw from the course. That's it. That's all. It's college. People only go if they want to. No one's mother can do anything about the workload. I had a student who I caught plagiarizing in an essay. The 0 was going to cause the student to not graduate on time. The parent called a meeting, but I had proof of action thanks to turnitin.com. I explained the assignment and I showed the parent my proof, and that's when she said, "But I wrote that part of the essay, not my daughter, so she didn't cheat, I did." 4-day weekend. Come back on Monday to 50 emails. Generally, we have 10 to 15 in my group. My voicemail had 10 messages. I had not gotten a voicemail once in my entire time at my school. A parent flipping out that their student is failing. How stupid I was for not allowing their student to do the work. How ridiculous I was that I could not give her student another chance. Last email and voicemail is husband apologizing because I'm not the teacher of this student. Got confused with the last name, I guess. Had 2 girls in my English class who obviously hated each other. They would exchange glares, talk a little too loudly about each other while in the same vicinity, etc. I talked to them about it separately and they both responded with, "I hate that stupid witch." Notified admin of the situation and called the parents. Next day, they decided to fight it out in class. After breaking it up, I find out that girl number 1 was accusing the other girl of wearing, quote, butt pads to make her butt look better. After discussing it with her parents, girl number 1's mom told her that only hoes wear butt pads and that she should do something about it. The butt pad girl, girl number 2, swore she wasn't wearing butt pads and that it was all natural. After telling her parents about it, they advised her to mess up that witch for talking smack. And that is how you end up with a fight in class over butt pads instigated by parents. Taught college, so my story is nice. Had a student failing horribly, less than 10%, but would not drop. Whatever, not my dime, not my problem. Anyway, grades come in and I guess his mother has the password to his account. Or perhaps he just told her his grade, F obviously. And I get an angry email insisting that there's no way he could have failed pre-calculus. Because my God, his father's an engineer and the student wants to be an engineer and he just has to be good at math. The best part is when you turn 18 and go to college, you're treated as an adult, even if you don't act like one. And there's a little box you check that says, "Allow my parents to see my records." Most kids don't check it, and by law, I'm not allowed to release any records to anyone, even parents. So I politely informed her that her son is considered an adult and I was not allowed to release any records and that she would have to contact him. Of course, this prompted a long, "I'm going to get you fired," that I forwarded to my dean, who came to my office for a long laugh. I actually feel pretty bad for the kid. Having a helicopter mom like that at that age will do him no favors. When I was a student teacher, we were preparing for parent-teacher interviews. My cooperating teacher and the VPs had to have a discussion with me in regards to meeting with one particular parent. Basically, let my cooperating teacher do all the talking. Usually I'd be expected to take the lead, as I'd been planning and teaching the course at this point for a while, because if we say the wrong thing, it's entirely possible that the kid will be showing up to school with bruises the next day. Apparently, the administration had already been involved with this individual and police multiple times before. In the end, everything turned out okay, as far as I know. I believe the student went on to graduate that year. Still something that sticks with me as a reminder that the profession isn't just lessons and grading. There's some real stuff that goes down occasionally. The dumbest parents I have experience with are really the ones I had no experience with. I generally have about 150 students at any given quarter, and parent-teacher conferences twice a year. I never get more than 6 parents. The past quarter was my worst ever. 1 parent showed up. What bothers me even more is that I teach middle school, an age group that really doesn't want to be in school, in an inner-city district, adding even more to students' drive. A complete lack of interest in your kid's education is the dumbest thing I can think of. Not me, but from a coworker of mine. She informed a parent that her 3rd grader was struggling with multiplication and division. She suggested that the parent work with the child on these skills. The parent refused because she never learned how to multiply or divide. Therefore, it had no practical use and she didn't see the big deal. I had a 5th grader blow up on me, shouting and screaming in the hallway. This was sort of the final straw for him. He had a long history of verbal abuse of staff in the school, and he was suspended for 6 days. State law allows the parents to have an informal meeting with the teacher and the principal of the school. Mom and dad come into this meeting with myself, the principal, and the guidance counselor. Principal introduces everyone. Mom interrupts, saying she has a major concern that needs to be addressed immediately. She accused the principal of being an imposter and demanded that everyone in the room take out their driver's license to prove that we are who we say we are. We all refused, and she batted about this for 10 minutes or so. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, she ranted about how the principal was an imposter and that this imposter principal, myself, and the superintendent were involved in a conspiracy to remove her son from the school. My first year of teaching, I had a student who was constantly sleeping in class. I called home about it, and the mother said that he was always on his computer or watching TV at night and she couldn't get him to stop. I was only 23 at the time and didn't feel confident enough to tell a parent how to be a parent. But if that happened now, I'd calmly tell the parent to go into the room and remove the offending technology. I had a kid that was very angry, got in fights with kids and teachers and so on. I worked with this kid and we were making a lot of progress. His mom believes in not sharing your feelings and keeping things bottled up. So she told him not to talk to me about his feelings anymore. For a year, anytime I tried to talk to him, he'd say, "Mom says I don't have to talk about my feelings, so I'm not going to." And I'd patiently tell him, okay. He got progressively worse and had such a hard year that year. After he came back from summer, he came up to me and gave me a hug and told me thank you for helping him. The next year, he did amazing. I'm really happy for him. But his mom really stunted his growth with her own fears of being open and vulnerable. She never liked me and my hippie ways. I work as an assistant at an art studio and we have a 7-year-old with seizure syndrome. Except I'm pretty sure she doesn't actually have it. I think she only had 1 seizure once and her mom freaked out and had her diagnosed. Now, this little girl loved to terrorize her mother. She's told me that. She looked up at me with her big brown eyes and gigantic toothy smile and told me that she likes messing with her mom and making her angry, because her mom is too protective and one of those hovercopter parents. So this little girl just jerks her mom every which way, and it's hilarious because her mom is just like that. Overbearing, extremely protective, and really bossy. She'll tell the main teacher and I how to teach her daughter, how to draw, and how many colors to use, etc, etc, etc. But we don't have to retaliate or even say anything because her daughter does it for us. That little girl is fantastic. My uncle was a teacher in a school for troubled kids for about 10 years, elementary. One day, a kid starts talking about how the plants in Dare are all over his house. My uncle, being a longtime surfer and product of the 70s, didn't say anything at first. Then, during a parent-teacher conference, the parents are just being flat out uncooperative. "It ain't my son's fault. You failing him. That on you. He do his homework. I see him." "Ma'am, he needs more folk." "Nah, you don't know what you're talking about. How'd you even be a teacher when you don't know nothing?" "I know you're cultivating marijuana at the same home where your son lives." Boom. He said she got a look on her face that was just priceless, like she had just pooped her pants. Then he told her, get rid of the plants, today, and sit down with your son and help him with his work. Or else. My mother is a K-12 teacher for a charter school that does homeschooling with the teacher checking in and reviewing things about once a week. It's meant for students who have difficulty in the public school system, which can range from dropouts to super smart kids to non-English speakers, and parents who don't have the time to do full homeschool. I used to help with grading the math and science and stuff, so I have tons of stories. One parent during the school year kept taking her daughter on trips to different countries, and then asking my mother to extend her work. We're talking about 5 or 6 trips during the year. That would be fine if it was laid out at the start of the school year and they could schedule accordingly. But this parent would take these trips spontaneously. Like, in a few days we're going to Russia, so she can't meet you next week like we scheduled 2 days ago. Another parent really peeved off my mother. 2 kids, brothers, both seniors, almost done with high school. All that was left was some sort of state testing done in a classroom. One brother shows up, but the other isn't there. My mom, the proctor for the exam, asks where his brother is. He replies, "He didn't feel like coming." She tells him that this is all he needs to graduate, so text him and get him to come here. He doesn't show. Halfway through the test, the kid's mother storms in the door, yelling at my mother, telling her off for making her son feel ashamed and humiliated. She flips a table over, no joke, grabs her son that's there, who looked like he wanted to die, keep in mind he's a senior, like 17 years old or so, and storms out of the door. Both brothers failed to get their high school degree as neither had completed the state test. The crazy mom then writes a scathing email to my mother's supervisor, talking about how she'd been lying to her, disregarding her problems and her children's education, and attempting to sabotage their chance at graduation. A 16-year-old freshman girl is constantly skipping class and starts failing at the beginning of the year. I call mother to inform her about missing class and missing grades. The mother puts me on speakerphone without telling me that the kid is listening on the conversation. I tell her that I'm concerned about the kid's attendance and seemingly poor academic habits. The mother blows up at me saying that I shouldn't worry about her attendance because it's not my business. She then says that she's self-employed and frequently far from the school and can't take the time to deal with her daughter's school issues. She later transfers out of my class to another teacher's. She failed the class anyway. My mom is a kindergarten teacher. Just a few months ago, one parent asked her if it was alright if she came in and gave the kids henna tattoos for a Christmas party. My mom decided to give the kids permission slips in order to participate and mentioned that the tattoos would be about the size of a nickel and would be holiday themed. Another parent, upon reading the permission slip, came into the school and complained to the principal that my mother was trying to turn the kids Muslim. The principal essentially told her she was a moron and to screw off. Not me, but a situation that happened in my school. We get a new student the last week of May with only 4 weeks of school left. In this school year, this student has only attended 2.5 weeks of school due to school anxiety. He has a whole team of professionals, his mother, and a one-on-one aide that works with him. This is also his 3rd school, kicked out of his 2 previous ones, and he's in 2nd grade. He had a generally good first day. Fist bumped his teacher, did a little bit of stuff, then went home and told his mother that it was the worst day of his life. Mom comes to school all up in arms about how we're ruining her precious little snowflake. The next day, his classroom teacher tried to get him to do some writing with her. The kid looks straight in her eyes and says, "My mother said I don't have to do anything. Are you calling my mother a liar?" Cue mother the next day all up in arms because the teacher called my precious snowflake a liar. So, due to his school anxiety, he doesn't have to do any work, interact with teachers, make any movement whatsoever except sit like a lump in his seat. The teacher, when giving an assignment to the class, has to specify to him, but you don't have to do anything if you don't want to. It's by far the stupidest situation I've ever witnessed. I don't want to call any parents dumb. In my experience, they're mostly doing the best they can for their kids, even if that best isn't what we'd hope for. However, I did have a student who came to my student teaching classroom 2 grades below reading level, and similarly behind in other subjects. She really wanted to learn, but she had some cognitive issues that didn't qualify her for special ed, but meant that she required a lot of time and personal attention to learn well. For that entire school year, I worked individually with her before and after school, while she was waiting for the bus or after she'd been dropped off, and often during her recess and art/gym/library, which she asked me to do because she wanted to learn and wanted the one-on-one attention. She improved markedly in reading and writing, which is what we were concentrating on. She wasn't caught up at the end of the year, but she was a heck of a lot closer. She failed the year, but because she had a speech issue, her parents could decide to send her to the next grade anyway. I tried and tried to convince her parents that she should be held back a year, because with another year of intensive help, which I was going to find a way to secure for her, I thought that she could be close to or on grade level and could possibly keep up with the other students after that. They refused because they didn't want the other students to make fun of her. I have no idea what happened after that because I moved to another state, but I bet it wasn't good. Our AP US history teacher was going to quit teaching after this year because he'd become disillusioned with the whole routine, I guess. He didn't tell us this until right before the AP test, and luckily we reignited his love for teaching. He told us this. He's the only AP teacher who doesn't curve tests, and his tests are the hardest between the 3 AP USH teachers. So a lot of kids with his class end up losing their 4.0s. So apparently kids' parents were trying to get him fired for it or something. I thought that was pretty crazy. He's a really nice guy too. For me, someone who really dislikes history, memorization is tedious, his class ended up being my favorite class. I used to work at a daycare for kids aged 18 months to 3 years. There was this one little 3-year-old boy that used to call all the teacher stupid B words and C words. He also had extreme anger problems that led to violence towards the other kids. He would often hit, kick, spit, and choke out other kids. Despite this, he could be the absolute sweetest boy and craved being held by teachers in one-on-one time where he could get full undivided attention. We all dedicated ourselves to making sure we gave him special time to work on these issues. His dad was in jail and he would often talk about how scared he was to be put in prison and other issues at home. We discussed this with the mom and asked her to help with his anger by helping him find other ways of expressing it, as well as work on his swearing. All she said was she tries to work on his swearing, but he sees it on TV and she can't help that, and that he inherited his anger issues from his dad, who was both verbally and physically abusive towards her, hence why he was in jail. It was so frustrating to work with a woman who didn't think she could control what her 3-year-old son watched on TV and was resigned to believing her son's anger could not be controlled because of his dad. As a 3-year-old, he was mirroring actions he had seen, and she didn't understand that by teaching the child proper behavior and outlets for his anger, it would drastically improve. Once Dad got out of jail, she pulled her son from school and moved to another state with the guy. I don't know if this is really dumb, but weird, I guess. I worked for a while as the assistant band director at a private high school, and one night after a football game, the director and myself were sitting in his office talking. One of the members of the band booster organization came in and closed the door and asked to talk with us. We agreed and gave him our full attention. He then explained how he had a marvelous plan that would help recruit for the band, which was to fix the election for homecoming queen. He told us that we could send mailers to every senior male, only senior males got to vote for homecoming queen, encouraging them to vote for one specific band girl, chosen by the band director of course, and also some kind of incentive such as coupons or monetary contribution. The band director and myself shared puzzled looks over his incredibly thought out plan on how to fix the homecoming queen race. He was convinced that through this we would raise awareness of the band program and then our numbers would skyrocket. We didn't tell him no, but we didn't tell him yes. Instead, we told him we'd think about it, and he left the office. After he left, the band director looked at me and said, "What the heck? No." I remember being 10 to 12 and having a student-led conference. It was going really well. Awesome grades, lots of friends, but I noticed a woman was being really mean to one of the teachers. And when my parents were talking to my teacher in private, part of the conference, she screamed, "My son is smarter than every kid in this room. This work is just not what he was made for. He deserves better." I went to a $30K a year private school and her son was very obviously disturbed in some way. When did your "something is very wrong here" feeling turn out to be true? A few years ago, about 1 a.m. Sunday morning, I had to take my dog out before bed. I live in a rough neighborhood and I am a female, so I usually have my guard up regardless of the time. Before I left the apartment building, my gut told me something was up. The street was completely void of traffic and people except for a van parked out to the side of the road. Outside of it were 3 people whom I quickly identified as male. Right away, my reaction is to keep my head low, put my jacket hood up, and not bring attention to myself. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see they were struggling. On closer inspection, I see 2 of the men are holding up the other man between them. I make the assumption that they're headed home after a night of heavy partying and they're just helping their friend get sick or something. I'm telling myself this to ease my fears. Then they notice me and they stop everything and freeze. I thought that was odd and no good, so I dragged my dog straight back to the building. I don't know if he even got the chance to pee that night. I go to bed and think nothing more of it, until it's time to take the dog out again in the morning. There was a notice in the elevator asking for witnesses as to exactly what I saw that evening, because a dead body had been found. So this wasn't a friend of theirs after all. They were ditching a body. Still upsets me to this day, and I will never ignore my intuition again. A storm was gathering as my dad was driving. I was 8, sitting in the back and looking out the window. I told him, "You better hurry, that construction crane looks like it might topple." Everybody laughed at the idiot kid. That evening, the whole family was watching the local news. They opened with that crane crashing down due to heavy wind. Although nobody had been hurt, I felt vindicated. I heard a strange noise when I woke up. I looked outside my bedroom window to see if anything there had made that noise, and saw my oldest cat sitting on the windowsill outside of the other bedroom. She was staring into the room as if there was something in there that she did not like at all but could not look away. At that moment, I knew there was something or someone in the other room. Then I heard the noise again. It was like a soft squeaking, like someone shifting his weight from one foot to the other on wooden floor. I don't have wooden floors. I told myself there could not be an intruder in that room. It makes no sense that someone could get in there without waking me up, and I gathered my courage and went to check it. When I got to the doorway, I saw 2 of my other cats in the hallway staring into the room, very agitated. I peeked around the corner and heard the squeaky noise again. It was one of my neighbor's cats, very afraid and being trapped on my desk by my cats. I grew up in a fairly quiet neighborhood, and when I was 12, we got our first dog. It was my job to take him for a walk every evening after dinner. This dog was the goofiest, sweetest golden retriever mix. Not a mean bone in his body. He never met a stranger, and when he would occasionally escape, we usually found him in a neighbor's yard playing with some kids. He was the farthest thing from a guard dog you can imagine. So I'm walking him one night after dinner by myself, and suddenly he stops dead in his tracks in the very middle of the sidewalk. Out of the trees lining the neighborhood, maybe 10 feet away from me, this guy just comes strolling on out. I was pretty skittish at that age, and I didn't like being alone with strange men, like at all, so I was immediately unnerved. The guy walked up to me and asked if my dog was friendly. I responded out of sheer anxious panic and said that yeah, he was. The guy reached out to pet him, though my dog snarled and snapped at his hand, which I had never seen him do before. I apologized, made some excuse I don't remember, and hurried away under the pretense of getting my vicious dog away from him. Turns out this dude was a predator who assaulted 3 other neighborhood kids in those trees, and my dog was probably the only reason I wasn't the 4th. When I was in university, I was walking home from the bars in the Bywood Market in Ottawa with my roommate at the time. It was about 2:30 a.m. and we were looking forward to getting home and ordering some pizza when we came across 2 guys and a very drunk girl. Initially, we didn't think anything about it because it was a pretty common sight on a Friday night. But as we walked behind them for a few minutes, we noticed how out of it she was. One of the guys was essentially carrying her, and her clutch was loosely dangling from her limp wrist. Our street came up, but instead of turning down it, we decided to see what was going on. The guys explained that she was one of their girlfriends and had had too much to drink, so they were taking her home. We asked them a few more questions. What bar they were at, where she lived, if she was an Ottawa U student, etc. They gave pretty convincing answers, but all the same seemed really uncomfortable and wanted us to go away. During the conversation, the guy holding his girlfriend shifted her position to get a better grip, which caused her arm to dangle down and drop her clutch. Before they could move, my roommate grabbed the clutch and took out her ID. My roommate then asked if they knew her first and last name along with her birthday. This is where things changed. The other guy got really aggressive and confrontational while the other was silent. They didn't know her name or birthday. I then pulled out my phone and called the police. The guy dropped her and they took off running. We waited with her for about 10 minutes until the police and EMS got there. We gave a statement but did not have much to go on other than their descriptions. Police told us they suspected she'd been dosed and that she was lucky we happened to be walking behind her. Pretty scary stuff. All the praise in the world to these 2 guys. Seriously, you guys are heroes. Too many people would have just taken it at face value and walked away, but you sensed something was wrong and followed through, and as a result protected this girl from a horrible experience. Got off the subway at night. There was one other person about a half a block behind me on my route home. This is a totally normal thing. Has happened thousands of times. Totally normal looking dude. Not even following me closely. I had a bad feeling. Such a bad feeling that when I turned the corner on my way home, I broke into a dead sprint and hid behind a dumpster in the shadows partway down the street. By the time he came around the corner, I was well hidden and could see him from my hiding place. As soon as I saw his reaction to the fact that I wasn't there, I knew I'd been right to hide. He started looking for me, muttering to himself. He went up and down the street, looking around corners. I hid and held my breath until he was gone. It was terrifying. I'm so glad I had that sudden, inexplicable impulse to hide and listen to it. This is another one of those times, guys. If your spider sense starts tingling, listen to it. My friends and I went on a booze run one night back in college. We live in Flint and we were at a friend's house in a relatively bad neighborhood. We had our friend who was 21 go in while the rest of us waited. As we're sitting in the parking lot, we notice a dude standing by the trunk of his car a few rows of parking spots ahead of us. I had a bad feeling about him, so I was watching him the entire time while my friends were all chatting it up and laughing. I noticed my other friend who was driving watching too. Sure enough, after watching us for a second, he pops the trunk, pulls out a pistol and starts walking towards us. We noped out of there and floored it around the parking lot right as our friend came outside, yelled for him to get in and sped off. Turns out there had been a ton of carjackings in that area over the last few months. Not me, but my mom. When I was about 10 years old, I got invited to spend the night at my really good friend's home. My mom said no. I begged her to let me go, but she was adamant that I couldn't. She said that she just didn't feel right about it and that no amount of pleading was going to change her mind. A few weeks later, my friend's dad was arrested for possession of illegal explicit material. After he went to trial, it was found that he had abused several young girls. He would have his daughter invite them over for a slumber party and then prey on them when they went to sleep. If my mom hadn't trusted her gut feeling, I could have been one of his victims. Several years ago on Thanksgiving, my mom was becoming extremely overwhelmed. The holidays have never been a great success in my family, and my parents had issues communicating, which led to a lot of stressful and tense dinners. And if it wasn't them, it was someone else starting a fire. Well, this year was bad. My mom had been cooking for hours to get ready to head over to my cousin's house. My dad was yelling about how we spend too much money on the holidays. It got to a point where my mom told me and my brothers to leave for the party ahead of them. We didn't get far from the house until a really bad feeling started sinking in my stomach. I knew my brothers felt something too. I said, "Can we go back?" And my older brother turned around immediately. When we got there, my father was gone. He had left out of anger and my mom yelled at him to leave. My mother was in her bed, laying still with an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside her. She was still conscious when we came in, but started shaking and was falling asleep. We called 911. I later learned that the pills she had taken would only have put her to sleep for a long time, not actually kill her, but clearly it was her intent. She's had severe depression, and after this, she got some real help. A little different perhaps, but I used to work for a company making barns. We were installing a rail made from old oil lines. I was using a large chop saw to cut the threaded ends off the pipe. A chop saw is basically a large gas-powered chainsaw with a 14-inch diameter fiber blade in this case. I'd gotten to the last cut, and as I stood up, I had the weirdest feeling that something was wrong. Didn't know what, but I knew something was off. I looked around and checked my cut, which was good. Didn't mark the concrete below. Stood there for a solid 5 minutes with saw in my hands, trying to figure out what was wrong. All looked good until I moved the saw enough to notice a large hole burning in the shin of my jeans. Turns out I had stood in the sparks. Luckily, there was enough left for shorts. Oh, that's a close one. This one definitely could have ended a lot worse. I don't know if I had a something is very wrong feeling for this. However, I felt something was off. I was at my mechanic getting routine work done on my car during summertime. I noticed that he had a coat hanger and every single hanger had a well-worn coat on it. I thought it was odd and out of place, but figured it's a mechanic shop. They probably just leave it there from the wintertime. No biggie. Not too long afterwards, maybe a few months, there was a drug bust at the shop. They were using those jackets to hold heroin. Our mechanic is in jail now, and honestly, he was a good mechanic, so I was disappointed. Ironically, my pediatric doctor got busted for bribery to prescribe certain medications and is likely going to jail too. Never had a vibe out of him though. This sucks too, since he was a great doctor. When I was younger, we would go visit my aunt a lot. Her brother-in-law was often there and sometimes watched her kids for her. Well, me and my sister just really didn't like him. We told our mom he made us uncomfortable and that we didn't want to be around him, even though he never did or said anything bad to us. Sometime later, it was discovered that not only was he abusing his teenage daughter, but he and his girlfriend were also abusing my infant cousin and taking photos of it. He's in jail now for a very, very long time. When I was in high school, I had gone to a party with some friends. From the moment we got there, something felt off. I bugged my friends to leave and tried to explain that something just felt off. Well, I was able to bug them for all of us to leave by bribing them with some steak and shake. We found out the next day that a bunch of police came about 15 minutes after we left and arrested most of the kids as well as a group of guys who were caught abusing a girl while she was passed out drunk. So glad we got the F out of there. I was walking with my daughter last week and we heard a siren as we approached a crowded intersection. Instead of stepping close to the edge of the street and waiting for the walk light like usual, my daughter stopped well back on the edge of the grass and touched my arm so I would do the same. A full 30 seconds later, a police car came screeching through the traffic and drove onto the sidewalk to get around cars stopped at the light. If we had been in the customary pedestrian waiting spot, I don't know if he would have seen us, and I'm sure he wouldn't have been able to stop. I asked my daughter why she'd stopped so far back, and she said, "I don't know, I just knew we should." Smart kid. Not me, but my mom, and I'm doing my best to recall the story she mentioned to me a few months ago. My mom has been a psych nurse for over 30 years at a private hospital. One of the patients she was looking after was a very boisterous person in her 40s, and she'd been in the hospital for over a week. One night, Mom noticed this lady was very lethargic, saying that she was just feeling tired and was going to have an early night and to get her meds early. This isn't going where you expect. Mom thinks this is very odd for this lady, but everyone has off days, and so she gives this lady her medication and she goes off to bed. About 5 minutes pass and Mom still has a knot in her gut about this lady and thinks she'll just check on her stats. So she goes to her room where the lady is just about to lay down and checks her blood pressure, pulse, and oxygen saturation. This is pretty rarely done in a psych hospital unless people have other health concerns needing monitoring. This lady's oxygen saturation was down to around 80%, I believe. To put it in perspective, if it falls below 92%, your cells can't absorb oxygen, and this can cause permanent damage. Mom, in her over 40 years of nursing, has never seen someone with such a low level. She checks again and the same result. Mom calls an ambulance and gets this lady on oxygen. Later that night, Mom gets a call from the hospital the patient was sent to from the doctor, who lets my mom know the lady's fine. She had a blood clot. If she had been left for another 15 minutes, the doctor is certain she would have died. The lady made a full recovery and gave Mom a beautiful scarf the next time she saw her. I have two. First, when I was 5, my late grandma was staying with us. One night, I woke up to some noise and found my parents and grandma up. She told me to be quiet and I realized that there was someone trying to pick the lock on our flat's door. While this is happening, my father was loading his shotgun and telling my mother and us to keep away from the door. He opened the door suddenly and tried to hit the guy with the stock of the shotgun. He started to run and my father after him, but he got away. Later that night, I learned that my grandma couldn't fall asleep, feeling there was something wrong, and then heard what was going on at the door and woke my parents. And when I was in high school, she had a stroke and lost the ability to speak. Because she was illiterate, it was hard for us to understand what she was trying to say. One day, I went to school after preparing her breakfast as usual. When I arrived, there was this urge telling me to go back home. I tried to pass it as boredom, but it got to a point where I felt very agitated and told my friends I'm going back home and left. When I was walking back home, I found my grandma wandering around without anyone. I asked her what she's doing. She pointed out like she's out for a walk, but I knew back then she couldn't find her way back without anyone because of her stroke. So I walked with her for a while and we returned back to the house to very worried parents. This was before cell phones. I've never believed in the supernatural. I'm not a religious person, but I experienced this. I don't know what to call it. My oldest daughter stopped by my work one day and introduced me to her new boyfriend. He seemed a little off to me, but I decided it was just guy dating my daughter and let it go. Later, he met my wife and I, and she told me later that he seemed off to her too. She has pretty good instincts about people, so we decided to investigate him a bit. Typing his whole name into Google, the first result was a mugshot from a couple of years ago. The third was an active warrant. More searching resulted in finding 3 warrants from different counties, an extensive record, check deception, theft, driving while suspended, driving after a lifetime suspension, and driving while a habitual traffic offender, and a brand new marriage license for him and my daughter. They were going to get married later that week. We of course told her about him, but she insisted that he had already told her about all that and had taken care of it. We emailed links to her roommate who showed her, but she didn't have any luck talking her out of the relationship. They were in love and everything would work out okay in the end. We sent in an anonymous tip and he was arrested the next day at her apartment. My daughter then found out he'd been lying to her about pretty much everything. He had entangled her in a business he was trying to start that mostly involved her financing things for him, since his credit was trash due to records for bounced checks and theft. She's still working to untangle herself from that. He's still in jail and, according to her lawyer, will be for at least 2 years depending on what happens in 2 other counties. Thank God the parents followed through on their instinct on this one. Apparently, there was already some damage done, but it would have been so much worse if they didn't do anything. I had a math teacher in middle school who came off as creepy. He would try and get close to us guys and try and act like old friends. He seemed afraid of girls for some reason. I didn't like him. He gave me a very bad feeling. After about a year at our school, he wasn't there suddenly. We had a police officer come in and sit us down and interview everyone individually. It turns out he was caught having an inappropriate themed party with some of his former male students from his previous school. He was sent to prison. I got to the airport early and got something to eat at the restaurant, boarded the plane, and everyone is on, and I suddenly get a feeling of panic. Nothing else, just panic. I was used to traveling 3/4 of the month back and forth every week, so no problems flying. But in this case, I had to get off that plane. I grabbed my stuff, ran past the flight attendant and said, "Don't wait for me, I'll get another flight," and sat down trying to calm down. An announcement comes over the speaker that they're looking for me and my flight is leaving. It leaves. I watched the flight start to take off. This was in Detroit, by the way. Then it happened. The worst cramps I ever had. Ran to the bathroom. Food poisoning from the restaurant. I would have been on a 2-hour flight, stinking up the plane while ejecting the contents of my stomach from both ends. I'm sure the entire passenger compartment thanks me, though they don't know. When I was a little kid, I stepped outside to walk home from my neighbors 2 doors over. I smelled what I knew was a bear, which are common where I live. If you've ever smelled a black bear, it's not that different from a skunk, which is what my friend's mom told me it probably was when I asked her to drive me home, even though my house was literally right around the corner. The thing is, a skunk's smell is strong, but it doesn't travel. A bear's smell is more permeating. Begrudgingly, she drove me only to see the bear sitting on my back steps outside the door I would have tried to enter my house with. Black bears aren't that vicious, but my friend's mom apologized immediately about not believing me. Could have walked straight into that thing at the age of 12. When I was doing my PhD, I got offered the chance to do a Central European University summer school program to do a course that would have been extremely valuable. I even got offered a full scholarship to do the course, and free accommodation, etc. A really amazing deal. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, I said to my boyfriend at the time that something's telling me I shouldn't go. And I was like, WTF, brain? This is the opportunity of a lifetime. But the don't go feeling just kept getting stronger. So I withdrew from the course, feeling stupid for doing it. The day after I was scheduled to leave, my perfectly healthy mom got sick. A week later, she was in a coma. A week later, we had to turn off life support. Her funeral was a week after that. I would have been away in her last waking moments. I knew some people who were really into off-roading in modified Jeeps. Once, they were invited by a group of people I did not know to go up a mountain in Colorado. They chose not to go, and everyone in the 4 Jeeps that went got caught in an avalanche and died. At a research institute, I walked into a mouse procedure surgery room for a quick moment to grab something and leave. After walking out, I felt, well, to be honest, like I was a little high. There were 3 other people in that room, including 2 undergraduates, so I got worried and went back inside to check things out. When I got back inside, I asked if they were feeling okay. One of the undergrads turned to me and said she was fine, but was flushed and looked a little out of it. So I went around to all the isoflurane chambers, an odorless volatile liquid that KOs mammals at low doses and kills them at higher, looking for leaks. Sure enough, the gasket at the bottom of one of the chambers had failed and it was leaking out and immediately boiling into gas and filling the room. I told them that their isoflurane was leaking, and the postdoc told me they were fine and that he uses that machine all the time. He also pointed out that the isoflurane was in an air curtain biosafety cabinet, and so even with the leak, they were protected. I called him an idiot because a biosafety cabinet recirculates air and doesn't evacuate it like a fume hood, which is what he should have been using. So I ignored him, propped open the door, and ordered the undergrads to get out of the room. I then went to their lab manager and told her what I'd found. Their lab manager came down like the wrath of God. Reddit, tell me your glitch in the Matrix story. I'm talking weird occurrences, coincidences you haven't been able to easily explain. I'll start. We have a breakfast laid on at work every morning. Just a simple buffet of eggs, bacon, what have you. Nothing huge, and it's really only to feed about a dozen people or so. I'm usually one of the first guys from my team to get to work, and the kitchen was deserted as usual. I walked into the little kitchen, and there was a ceramic egg tray thing with 12 eggs in it, like the bottom half of an egg carton with a socket for each egg. All spaces are filled with warm, freshly boiled eggs. I take one, walk over to the garbage bin, shuck the shell, then I walk back over to the food and stop dead. There are 12 eggs in the tray again. No one entered the room while I was peeling the thing. I touched the mystery egg, and it was the same temperature as the other eggs around it. Not a big thing, nothing major, but something very strange, given one does not get presented with strange eggs from a parallel universe every day. I peeled and ate that one too. When I was around 20, a few years ago, I kept having dreams about a woman with long black hair named Aurora. They were different dreams, but for some reason, her distinct face and name always ended up in them. It got to a point where I would wake up frustrated and confused, trying to Google her name or find out how I was connected to her. After a few months, she stopped showing up and I dismissed it, thinking my brain was just being a scumbag. Fast forward a few years later, Halloween 2009. I'm in the car with a friend stopped at a gas station. I'm about to pull out and merge onto a highway when I get a phone call from a random number. So I stopped the car, but no one answered. There was a person behind me who grew impatient, honked at me, and then swerved in front of me instead of waiting for 2 seconds for me to move. Second they get on the highway, some silver Civic loses control of their wheel and crashes into the car that swerved in front of me. I called the cops and waited at the gas station for them to come. Turns out the drivers of both cars had died. It 100% would have been me if I hadn't have gotten that phone call. Called it back a few hours later out of gratitude and curiosity. Rang 3 times and went to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Aurora. Please leave your name and number. Never had goosebumps like that in my life. Called it again the next day because I was that confused about the whole situation. Some woman answers and we get to talking. I tell her my entire story including the dreams I had. She tells me she doesn't know how I got her number and that she never called me as far as she remembers. Weird. Ask her if she has a Facebook to confirm if she is in fact the woman in my dreams. Check her Facebook? Holy crap, it's her. If that's not a glitch in the Matrix, then I'm just crazy. This happened about 15 years ago. I called my friend up and he wasn't home, so I left a message on his answering machine. I said, "Hey, it's me. Sorry I missed you. Call you later. Bye." And then I hung up and left the house. I made no other calls. Later that day, he called back and says, "Wow, that was quite a message you left. Who was that girl you were talking to?" I was like, "What are you talking about? I wasn't talking to any girl." Well, as it turns out, the message didn't end after I said bye. I had to go over to his house and listen to this message a few times. After my initial message that I did leave, there was a slight pause and it continues for another 30 or 40 seconds or so of me talking to some strange girl. It was my voice, but a conversation I never had with a girl whose voice I didn't recognize. You could compare it to the message I know I did leave, and the two voices were indistinguishable. Not just the voice, but, you know, talking mannerisms. It was my voice. Also, references to my occupation and activities were the same. Basically, in this conversation, I was talking to this girl about going skiing, but I had to go down to my shop and work on a car first, which totally correlated to me. Then the message just stopped. It was recorded on one of those digital answering machines that recorded the message to a chip, so there was no tape I could have taken and had analyzed, unfortunately. Also, neither I nor my friend had party lines, so that's not an explanation. It was very freaky. I can't explain it. Driving home on a stormy day, I see that a side road up to the local golf course is blocked off by flashing barricades. I also spy a Mercedes parked past the barricades with its hazards on. I stop and walk up to the car to see if they need any help. I'm an EMT. I shine my light in the back seat to see a man slumped over apparently asleep. Thinking I've got a few drunks, I move up to the driver window and rap on the glass and shine my light in. The driver is sitting bolt upright, unmoving, staring straight ahead. My window rapping or light doesn't cause him to blink, flinch, or move. I look over and the passenger is slumped forward onto the dash. This begins to creep me out. I call down to the sheriff's station and request a unit to come up to my location to help me check them out, since the doors of the car were locked. While on the phone, I walk back to my truck to get my go bag. As I'm on the phone with dispatch, she asks me to get a license number for the car, just as a massive truck comes rumbling down from up the closed road. I move to go around the truck to get the plate number, and the car's gone. I talked to the driver of the truck and he said there was an 80-foot tree down across the road and that he didn't think it'd be open for a day or so. The question is, where did the car go? Tree up one way, barricades down the other. It's kept me a bit unsettled when stopping at accidents and hazards since then. This happened to me in the 3rd grade, and it scared me so much I started crying and had to go to the office to talk to the principal about it. I was in the hallway for misbehaving, and my neighbor, Tad, a year younger than me, came walking out of a class to my right, passed in front of me, and headed down some stairs. We said hi to each other. About 20 seconds later, he walked out of the same class, passed in front of me, and headed down the stairs. I just stared at him, confused and afraid, and he looked back like, "Why are you looking at me like that?" that. I never realized how much it was like the Matrix deja vu. At 12 years of age, my mom let me stay in the truck as she went grocery shopping. As I wait, I see an old guy walking towards the truck with an indescribable look at me as if I know too much. He stops 5 feet from the truck, looks at me for a couple of seconds, and heads back the exact way he came. It was rather traumatic for some reason and very confusing at that age. 5 or 6 years later, my dad was showing me home videos of us at Yellowstone. At Old Faithful, I noticed the same guy, same look, same clothes, peering at us on camera and at me through the TV. I'm freaked out just telling this. At a friend's place back in 2008, when we were all teenagers, we had a cool shed at a friend's that we'd hang out in every weekend. It had 4 sets of bunk beds, tables, a fireplace, TV, fridge, etc. The whole lot. One night, we were all hanging out in there when I decided I needed to use the bathroom. I walked out the front door of the shed and started walking to the right where I stopped. Now, let me explain the layout here. As you walk out of the shed, his house is to the left, and to the right is where we all parked our cars. Further out, you're left with empty fields and trees. It was dark by now, the lights from the house illuminating the space between the house and our cars, but trailing off just past them. As I took a step to the right, intending to go behind the cars to relieve myself, I saw my friend's older brother standing there. I watched him for a good 5 to 10 seconds as he stood there, facing into the darkness. He then proceeded to walk behind a couple of trees and a car before he disappeared. Confused, I walked back into the shed and asked my friend what his brother was doing by the cars. The conversation went as follows. "Hey man, what's your brother doing by the cars?"
What do you mean?
"He just walked off behind the cars." "I'm right here." I looked over and there his brother was, sitting down on one of the chairs with a drink. He was wearing the exact same clothes I saw him in, and the only way to get into the shed was through the door that I was standing in the way of. To this day, I have no idea how it happened at all. I'm guessing I was just seeing things, but the fact that I watched him walk around for a good 10 seconds has always puzzled me. I've never had anything else like this happen. I have one of these that involves the Matrix. I got my wisdom teeth out in 2000, right around the time that the original Matrix came out on VHS. I was bombed completely out of my mind on Percocet after coming back from the surgery. I had awful wisdom teeth, and my mom basically just dropped me in bed and went and rented the movie for me because I'd never seen it in theaters. I remember being irritated that the sun through the window was making the TV glare, but being too out of it to get up. A little bit after the black cat glitch in the Matrix scene, I passed out and apparently slept for about 8 hours. The tape in the VHS machine kept rewinding itself and playing over and over again. I woke up and the movie was at roughly the same spot as when I passed out, but it was completely dark outside. 0 time lapse for me. Completely lost my mind. Started freaking out and screaming because I thought I discovered the secret and somebody turned off the sun. I remember crying and trying to explain to my panicked family who have never let me live it down. I think the strangest glitch I found was back when I was in high school. I was talking to a friend on the phone, describing a dream I had about an ice skating rink, and then he starts to describe the rest of the dream to me from the opposite point of view. It was a while ago, so I don't remember everything, but we both described the scenery, what the people were doing, etc. It really freaked me out when it happened. My dad has this little toy monkey that he used to call his favorite child and tease me and my siblings with it. Not in a bad way, but it was really frustrating to us and we spent hours trying to steal it from him. Well, anyways, one day we got it and threw it in the garbage after drawing on it and mangling it for a bit. My dad laughed and searched for it for a bit, but basically figured we'd thrown it out and gave up after a week or so. Anyway, a few years later, when I was about 17, I'm walking down the street in Toronto. I don't live in Toronto, was just visiting friends, and see this little orange object on the side of the road. When I walk over to it, I pick up and see that it was the exact same monkey. It even had the black Sharpie lines on it from when we drew all over it. I honestly cannot even come up with the chances of that happening, especially considering our garbage is sent to a local dump and is nowhere near Toronto. I actually took it with me and killed it with fire just so I knew it wouldn't come back again. I had a friend in high school. Let's call him Bob. Bob was a very nice fellow, and while we weren't that close, we had similar tastes in music and we'd share CDs. This is the late 80s, way before file sharing. Anyway, we eventually graduated and I moved several hundred miles away to college, and we lost touch. When I left for college, I had one of Bob's CDs still in my possession, Beat by King Crimson. Fast forward 10 years. I'd graduated college and was knee deep in my career, and finally saved up enough money and bought my first house. house. In the new house and while unpacking, I see the CD in a box. Hadn't noticed it in many years and thought, gee, I should really track down Bob and return this. Right then, the doorbell rings. It's Bob, and he says, "Hey, you wouldn't happen to still have my King Crimson CD, would you?" I look down. I'm holding it in my hand. I hand it to him and his mouth drops open. Mine probably already is. We exchanged pleasantries and I probably asked him how he found me, but I no longer remember. He eventually takes off. I haven't seen Bob since. I was a satellite installer and I was driving between two small towns in North Carolina, Statesville and Taylorsville. It's about a 20-minute drive of a perfectly straight 2-lane road with pretty much nothing but trees on either side. It's the middle of the day and I'm driving along listening to Howard Stern on Sirius when all of a sudden I go from wide awake to falling asleep, meaning 1 second I'm normal and a second later my head is drooping down and eyes closing. And what snaps me out of it is my car bounces like it just hit a speed bump, but I'm still in the middle of the road. Howard Stern is still in the same sentence, but my GPS signal says it's lost. And then I hear recalculating. And when it comes back, I realize I'm about 12 miles further down the road than I was, and I'd missed my turn by 5 miles. My immediate thought, even though I consider myself a level-headed atheist, was that I fell asleep, hit a tree, and died, and was now in some weird afterlife. It was such a strong feeling that I drove to the nearest gas station, got out, headed inside with sweaty palms, feeling that the cashier inside was not going to be able to see me. To my relief, she did, and I bought a Red Bull. I still think I was hypnotized by the road and drove on some weird autopilot for a while, but losing the GPS signal and not missing any of Howard Stern is unexplainable to me. I even used the Sirius ability to rewind, and there was none of the show that I missed. I used to work in a building that had 3 levels of sub-basements, with the piece of lab equipment I typically worked on in the lowest basement. I had the only key. There was a wired phone in there and I did work late some nights, but not this night. I was sleeping alone in my apartment when I woke up to a call on my cell phone from my girlfriend at 3 a.m. She was in hysterics asking why I scared her. Apparently, she received a call from that basement phone just a minute earlier, with someone who sounded like me slowly repeating her name, until crackling and fading out. My apartment was 10 miles away from work. I thought she was lying, but I saw the 3 a.m. call from the basement phone logged on her cell myself. Still freaks me the heck out. My friend used to put up a recurring away message back in the day when everybody had AIM. She was a Beatles superfan and put up a sentiment from John and Yoko, "Acorns for Peace." Well, one day I was walking around my college campus thinking about it, but failing to remember the full quote for some reason. In my mind, I kept thinking, something for peace, something for peace. What the heck is that message anyway? Right then, some chick on a cell phone walks by me and screams, "Acorns!" I realize this is not a super freaky story, but it made my day at the time. It's not every day someone screams out "acorns" in your vicinity at the exact right time. I have 2 stories that are just super weird. Both of them are things I would just not believe if someone else told them to me, but I can swear with every fiber of my being that they happened as I write them here. The first happened a couple years ago. I can't remember the occasion, but my mother and I had gone to A&W for lunch, and we were both sitting there eating our meals. We happened to be seated pretty close to the washroom doors, so I noticed everyone who was going in and out. First person to come out is this old man who's kind of hobbling along. He walks past and I looked at him and went on with my meal. Not 30 seconds later, another man comes out of the bathroom, and at this point, I get a little freaked out because I realize it's the exact same person. Same limp, clothing, face, everything. A couple minutes later, the same thing happens, except it's an old woman this time. She comes out, then 30 seconds later, comes right out of the bathroom again. My mom took a look at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I just kind of stammered a bit, then wrote it off as me being crazy. The second story is more weird in my opinion, and the single strangest occurrence of my life. This happened when I was about 9 years old, but I can still remember it vividly. We were visiting family in Nevada with my dad, and they lived out in a very dry area in a fairly good-sized trailer. A couple days in, I was playing with my cousin, pretty much just messing around in the dirt. At some point, I look up. Right next to the house is field, I guess, surrounded by wire fence, probably originally for livestock. But anyway, there's this guy standing there. This is a good 300 or more feet away, so I can't see him clearly. Cue the weird. As soon as I look at this guy, I have what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. My body pretty much just went into lockdown and I was no longer seeing through my eyes. And I wasn't just floating there or anything. I was in that man's body. Through his eyes, I could see two little shapes playing across the field, but I could just feel that he saw the shapes as animals. And then I realized he was holding a shotgun. After that, I regained my body and blurted out, "We have to go indoors," offering no explanation to my cousin, who thought I was nuts. I didn't tell anyone because I just didn't know how to express it to other people back then. I've only since told my brothers, but I don't think they believed me. Still freaks me out when I think about it today, because it's the only time I've ever lost control of my body. It was almost like a dream, but the whole thing was happening in slow motion. Josh, the guitarist of the band's best friend Matt, had died a couple of years back. He always talked about the kid and he seemed like a great guy. Josh always had this reoccurring dream where Matt was standing on this abandoned street, which supposedly was metaphorical for purgatory. Josh had all these conversations with Matt in these dreams, and because he had overdosed unexpectedly, he felt like his spirit was not able to move on. At the end of the dreams, Matt would take a bulb from the street light on the street they were standing in the middle of. Josh described these dreams in extreme detail, and I could pretty much picture what the street looked like. Fast forward to about 6 months into touring with these guys. They were huge Bright Eyes fans and wanted to stop in Cassadaga, Florida. Bright Eyes singer wrote an album there, and it's a really creepy, spiritual medium place. It might be worth noting that 6 out of 7 of the people that I was with were all atheists. So we drive into Cassadaga around 2 or 3 a.m. and drive around. Suddenly, this big black dog comes in the middle of the road and just stops and looks at us. The guys in this band were weird as heck and were saying things like, "Follow the dog, it's trying to show us something." And in my mind, I'm just thinking they're all idiots. We follow this dog for a few blocks as it was walking pretty slowly. All of a sudden, we turn a street and this dog bolts. We try to speed up, but Josh says, "Stop the van. This is it." We're all confused and he gets out of the van and looks around. This is it. This is the street in my dreams. We hang out for about 15 minutes, and from the way he described the street, from having houses on the left to a park on the right, it was definitely the street. As we get in the van, a street light goes off and we just drove off. He claims he never had any more dreams about it, and that was closure on everything. My dad used to get up around 3 a.m. every morning for work. Starting at a very early age, I would wake up on my own and wander downstairs to see him before he left. One morning, when I was about 4 years old, I made it to the bottom of the stairs and noticed that the front door was ajar. I opened it up and saw my father in his favorite work shirt making his way down the driveway to his truck in his typical work outfit, plaid shirt and dickies. I swung the door open wide and yelled for him to come back for a hug before he left. He slowly turned around and just stared at me and started walking back towards the house. He was looking so strangely at me that it started to scare me, and I began crying and asking what was wrong. Just as he had almost reached me, a pair of arms encircled me from behind in a big bear hug. I turned my head to see my understandably freaked out father staring at his doppelganger in the same outfit. The double took one look at my dad and ran down the driveway. Meanwhile, my dad yanked me in the house and locked the door. Weirdest morning ever. Never did quite figure that one out. I would not trust my 4-year-old memory of the event if it wasn't also witnessed by my father. He won't really talk about it to this day, but my mom has told me that he called out of work and she spent the day reassuring him he wasn't a nutcase. I was in class one day, sitting in a group of 3 people, including myself. We were talking and my friend dropped his pen on the desk. I saw it stall in midair for a second, then drop on his desk. My friend asked, "Did anyone else see that?" All my friends saw it, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. To this day, I have no explanation for it. It wouldn't be a big deal if there weren't 3 of us that witnessed it happen. Runaway brides of Reddit, what's your story? What was the final straw? How last second did you leave? On my 18th birthday, my boyfriend proposed to me at my party, in front of all my family and friends. I said yes mostly because I was too embarrassed to say no. We'd been dating for 2 years, but I was just about to start university. I wasn't ready at all. I asked later, when we were alone, if we could have a long engagement, at least a year or two, and he agreed. We told our families and friends we would be waiting to get married. Less than 3 months later, his mom and my mom took me out for lunch and decided to take me to look at wedding dresses, because it's never too early to start planning. When I saw a really lovely dress that was on sale, my fiance's mother insisted on buying it for me. Their family was quite wealthy and had money set aside for all of my fiance's milestones: education, first car, wedding, etc. She told me they were happy to cover the major costs as they were the ones who wanted a big wedding, and I joked I could pay her back in grandchildren. A few weeks later, his mom introduced me to a friend who was a florist. Next thing I know, I'm looking at bouquets and discussing table arrangements. Then my fiance starts talking about venues for our wedding, saying we need to start planning so we can find the perfect place. By this point, I'm truly panicking. I'm just a few months into university. I haven't even fully decided what I want to do with my education. Now I'm choosing venues for a wedding that's supposed to be years away? A wedding that's suddenly looking like nuptials of a minor royal? I tried talking to my fiance, but he just wouldn't listen. We saw a venue we liked, but they had no availability for almost 2 years. So we booked it and I could finally breathe again. I had 2 years to get ready for my big fat crazy wedding. Then the venue had a cancellation for less than 6 months away, and my fiance accepted it without telling me. Just canceled our future date and took the one that was now available. Then he arranged the entire wedding with the help of his mom and mine, damn her helicopter ways, before telling me. When he told me everything was booked, I went mental. His reaction was that he'd gone with all of my choices regarding catering, venue, flowers, etc., and so I should be grateful that he dealt with all the stressful stuff. All I had to do was turn up. When I explained that I didn't want to get married in 6 months' time and that this was the 3rd or 4th time I told him I wasn't ready for marriage yet, he told me that I was being childish and that the invitations were at the printer, so it was too late to change my mind. I finally realized that he was manipulating me, so I gave him the engagement ring back and told him I didn't want to see him anymore. I told my family and friends, cried a lot, changed my number because he wouldn't stop calling, etc. 2 months later, my mom got a call from his mother because she hadn't been able to get in touch with me to arrange dress fittings and finalize bridesmaids. He hadn't even told them we split up. My mother explained everything to his mother and figured that was that. The following week, she had the audacity to present my family with a bill for half of what they paid out for the wedding. It came out to thousands of pounds. They'd booked everything, right down to the cake and the favors, without telling me and wanting me to pay. My friend met a guy and within a week they were engaged. He was in the military and ghosted her about a month after proposing. 6 months later, he turns up and starts working at the same place as her and acted like he didn't even know her. Does that count? I was 17 at the time and still in high school. Met an alleged army guy, pre-full swing internet, so no way to really check, and we hit it off. I was young and fell in love with guys real fast, so when he proposed, I was ecstatic. The red flags were there. He asked my parents for permission. He proposed loudly at a pizza shop, which socially would have been too awkward to say no anyway. He didn't have his own place. I never met his family, and I never saw any evidence of being in the military. Cue a few weeks later, we had a fight because he called out his sister's name during sex. He then told me that everything would be fine because he was going to take me to Kentucky to live on an army base. He also told me he wanted me to be barefoot and pregnant most of the time. Ha ha ha. We were going to get married and leave the day after I graduated high school. I did some real soul searching. I became withdrawn and quiet. I was visiting my Nana one day and she asked me, "Are you in love with him or in love with the idea of a wedding?" And just like that, the bubble burst. I cried and broke it off with him 2 weeks before I graduated. Apparently, he'd already booked the justice of the peace, but he got married anyway 3 weeks later with the same ring he gave me. Poor girl. I wish I knew her so I could warn her. Had a friend that didn't know she was the bride until she was halfway down the aisle. Her parents had arranged a marriage for her, common in her culture, and had told her that the family had all been invited to a cousin's wedding. My friend was told everyone was going to be wearing white for whatever reason. I don't remember. They arrived at the church just before the bride was scheduled to walk down the aisle. My friend, thinking they're late, wanted to slip in and stay in the back. Her father, however, takes her arm and they start walking up the aisle. It isn't until they're halfway up that she stops and realizes everyone is looking at her and smiling and crying tears of joy. She turned to one of her aunts in the pew next to her and asked them who was getting married. The whole church went silent, and then the aunt looked at my friend's father and said, "You can't be serious. You planned a wedding for your daughter and just expected her to go along with it? Have the two of them even met? Did you seriously think this would work?" The whole room was then chattering about them, and the father just cleared his throat and told his daughter to keep walking. Luckily, the aunt grabbed my friend first and pulled her into the pew, pushed her past the row of people, and they both ran out of the church. Her parents disowned her after that, and she moved in with that aunt. At least she had one person in her family who was looking out for her interests. A woman I briefly dated was a runaway bride. Her ex never hit her but constantly belittled her and was basically emotionally abusive. Your standard kid, telling her she was lucky he wanted her, that she could never find anyone better, that she was ugly but he dealt with it, etc, etc, etc. She was a smart kid, was a medic in the military, saving dozens of lives in Pakistan. But emotionally manipulative people can get anyone if given enough time, and he got her. On her wedding day, her dad, who wasn't usually in the picture, having divorced when she was a teen, was having a conversation with her in the ready room, and got concerned when she started repeating a lot of the things her fiance was saying to her. She said that she was mid-sentence when he stood up and said, "Let's go to Dairy Queen," out of the blue. When she was little, they often went to DQ and talked over ice creams. She took a second, agreed, and they left to go to DQ. But he drove 3 towns over, and they sat and talked over ice cream for hours while her phone rang the battery dead in the car. She said she felt like a huge weight was lifted and felt bad that her friends and family were waiting for her, but they would all understand later. He eventually got back to the church and told the bridal party it wasn't happening, and got his buddies to come and move all her stuff out the next day. She said that while her dad wasn't the best father in her teens, he was the best dad anyone could ask for that day. We dated for a couple weeks before we figured out we weren't a good match. We parted amicably, but I haven't talked to her since. Not me, and I'm not sure if it counts as a runaway, but my sister broke up with her fiance 4 months before their wedding, which was already planned and paid for. I'll be honest, I don't know the full story. Even now, 18 months later, she still hasn't fully opened up to us about it. But I never really liked the guy. He was nice enough, but he absolutely could not handle his drink. He could never have a little drink. No, he had to drink the whole bar every time, then would come home and puke up over the entire house. He then had the audacity to complain whenever my sister would go out with her friends just for a couple drinks, to the point where he eventually just stopped letting her go out altogether. His family was an absolute mess as well. His mom and stepdad were pretty cool, but they moved to Canada to pursue their dreams, leaving my sister and her fiance in the hands of aunts and uncles who did not approve of her at all. His little brother was on-off with his teenage girlfriend he eventually knocked up, and who was always trying to one-up my sister too. Eventually, as far as she's told us, she just felt trapped by the guy. She was prohibited from hanging out with her friends and was forced to go to family events with people who despised her. He made her distance herself from us, which I think was painful for her as she essentially missed quality time with her new nephews at the time. He basically controlled every aspect of her life. Anyway, she unceremoniously dumped him on New Year's Eve and canceled the wedding then and there. I don't think she ever saw him again after that. She was always out when he came to collect his stuff. Obviously, his family weren't too happy about it and harassed her for months. She became depressed and needed medication, but it was my family that had to foot the wedding bill anyway. They were just glad to have their daughter back. My dad was a runaway groom, broke it off 3 days before the wedding, mid-1970s, so he was in his early 20s. His fiancée, not mom, obviously, and her mother pressured him into proposing, which he did with my grandmother's ring. He also felt society sort of demanded it. It was more common to marry at that age than it is today. Deep down, he knew she simply wasn't the one, but figured maybe all men felt that way before a wedding, so he ignored that and hoped his feelings would change. Months passed and the wedding was all planned out. out. When relatives and friends from out of town began flying in for the wedding and gifts were arriving, reality hit him hard, and he, to quote Joe Bluth, realized he made a huge mistake. He sat my grandma and grandpa down and said, "Guys, I don't want to do this." They were proud of him for being honest and actually sort of thrilled. It turns out they hated her guts, but they told him he needed to immediately tell her face to face. And so my dad did. Like a scarred war veteran, he refuses to tell me the details, but said it was the most gut-wrenching conversation / argument / hell he had ever experienced. But he ended it. Of course, this was the 1970s. You can't just announce the wedding is canceled via a text or Facebook message, which a friend of mine did. My dad took the responsibility of calling every single invited guest to tell them the wedding was off. Even more, he personally returned the gifts to the people who sent them. His fiancée sold my grandmother's ring. My boyfriend at the time had a female friend who, the night before her wedding, finally spilled to several friends, including him, that her fiancé had been emotionally and physically abusing her, and she wasn't sure she could get married. We'd all noticed her being distant from us, but she would deny every time that something was wrong. The next day, her family mobilized to get the word out to all of her guests, and a bunch of her friends essentially forced themselves into the guy's house to get all her things back. My boyfriend was a cop, so had a duty to press charges or say something to the guy. I was never clear on this part. The woman was pissed off at him for a while, but now a few years later is seeing someone great whom I've actually known forever and is quite a bit happier now. Plus, she knows friends and family have her back and can get things done. I was engaged, so almost a bride, and there were several final straws. A few were before the engagement. He lived in his car at the time, no judgment on that, but it is relevant, so was not financially stable, and this was just a couple of weeks into dating. Another was him wanting me to send selfies of myself, proving where I was at all times, and what I was wearing, which was 99.9% my work clothes. Black long sleeve shirts and pants, cause I'm a server, and I'm at work. So if I wasn't texting back fast enough, apparently I was with another man. About a month into the relationship, he demanded a key to my condo so he could see me whenever he wanted. The final straw was when he proposed, for down on one knee and said, "I knew we were meant to be each other the moment we matched." On Tinder, go figure. "I love you so much. Now I can show everyone I own you. Will you marry me?" Boy, bye. That was 3 months into the relationship. I had never met his family, but heard a lot about them. He had only ever met my mother, but that wasn't planned. I said no immediately and walked away. He tried getting into my condo countless times and calling me. Unfortunately, I had to change my number and get a restraining order against him. He was, and probably is, still crazy AF. One of the people I know is what's called a serial fiancé. She dates guys right until they propose to her. Then she says yes, starts looking for venues, dresses, etc., and then she calls off the wedding and breaks up with the guy, saying, "I didn't want to marry him anyway. He's..." insert reason here. The last time this happened, she had an AMA about her wedding on Instagram, but 2 months before the supposed date of the wedding, all of her photos, AMA answers, and mentions of engagement were gone. Maybe she's getting a kick out of it. I don't know. Not me, but my mother. My mom called off a wedding just weeks before the ceremony date because she found out her fiancé had lied to her about his whereabouts and was partying at a hotel with friends and other women. She caught him in a hot tub at 1 a.m. with twin sisters. Fast forward about 3 years later, she starts dating and marries the man who's my biological father. She said meeting the family was especially awkward when she discovered my father had 3 sisters, 2 of which were the twins she caught her ex-fiancé with in the hot tub. Years ago, I was a single mom, working hard but not getting ahead at all. Met a good guy type, architect, good sense of humor, etc. We dated for about a year, then got engaged. Then the unthinkable happened, and this is where I'm the jerk in many people's minds. He was in a horrible car accident, broke both of his femurs and his back, about 10 months before our wedding. He was a diabetic as well, so his healing was significantly delayed. He ended up confined to an electric wheelchair, and since his legs were in casts from hip to ankle, his legs had to be extended straight out in front of him at all times. I really tried to stick by him, but he made it impossible. He did nothing but complain and moan about every single thing that the doctors told him. Refused physical therapy, would not take his medication correctly, did not cooperate with wound care, wouldn't take his insulin correctly, all the things that make for a horrible patient and even worse person to be around. He managed to get addicted to the narcotics, sleeping pills, and Xanax as well. Through all all of this, our wedding planning was still happening, mostly by his family. He was moved from the hospital to a live-in group home where he only declined. Wearing pants was difficult, so he wore nothing on his bottom half for months, just happy with a bedsheet over his lap. No matter what, his moods were totally uncontrollable. He became violent and so verbally abusive. One evening, he missed the final Jeopardy question and threw his open urinal at me. Even after the doctors had insisted that he had to start bending his legs, he absolutely refused. Nope, not gonna do it. Fast forward to my wedding day. The staff at the group home went balls to the wall to decorate the backyard and make this day so special for everyone. It really was lovely. Our families were gathered and seated and the pianist was playing and my dad was by my side. They opened the door for us to start down the aisle and there he sat, with his legs straight out and hospital socks sticking out under a blanket. I froze. Told my dad I needed to go back in the house. Once we were out of earshot of everyone, I told my dad I couldn't do this. I'm so sorry. My dad simply smiled and said, "Thank God." He signaled for my kids to come to the side, loaded them and me in his car, and we drove off. We ended up moving a state away, closer to my family and thriving. The groom did end up in and out of several facilities and has never left the wheelchair. I realized fully that he was suffering from the type of physical, emotional, and mental pain that I will never comprehend. But I knew that I could not raise my kids in that type of environment, and my first commitment was to them. I went on to finish my own degree, and my kids are now adults. No one has thrown urine at me since. I know this must have been a very difficult decision for the original poster, and it sounds like she did her time. She tried to make things work, but I understand where she's coming from. You know why the person's behaving the way they're behaving, and that they are going through a lot of stuff themselves. But when they're not willing to accept any help from you to try and make the situation better, and instead end up just dumping a lot of that stress onto the other person, this isn't a healthy relationship. She made the right decision, and I'm glad she did it. I was almost the runaway bride, and I regret not making that decision. Dated my high school sweetheart for almost 2 years before the jealousy became overwhelming. I broke up with him a month after we graduated, but we were going to the same college and met up again that fall. I found myself pregnant by that October and was kicked out of my Catholic home. His parents let me stay with them, but we could no longer live in sin and had to be married. I didn't want to go back to living in my car, so I agreed. My parents wiggle back into my life before the wedding. Fast forward to the day of the ceremony and the music begins playing. I stand to start walking down the aisle. My dad takes my hand and says, "You know, you don't have to do this. You could just come home with us." WTF? Could he have mentioned this an hour, a day, a week before? I've always hated drama and didn't want to be that person. So I just said that I couldn't, and I got married. My ex was controlling, manipulative, and how abusive he was had become much less subtle since I became pregnant and turned overt when we moved out of his parents' house a year later. I ran when he nearly hit our baby's skull with his shoe, which he threw because he'd found something in the carpet I didn't vacuum properly. Yeah, I totally should have picked the runaway bride option. Not a bride, so to speak, but I ran away from a proposal. I was dating this guy who, in hindsight, was abusive, but at the time I just didn't know it. I knew he was bipolar, diagnosed, and came from a very unstable family. I tried being his rock and getting him to a better place, and sometimes everything was fine, and then others he was just such a jerk. He started talking about marriage about 1 year into the relationship. We had already split up and gotten back together twice due to him throwing tantrums and having wild mood swings about how he felt about the relationship. I just sort of nodded along because, well, I did think I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, but I wasn't ready to get married yet. I figured he was talking about someday far in the future when we were on more stable ground. A month later, he proposed. Not even in a very eventful way. Not saying has to be. I mean, I just didn't see it coming. We were at his house, as usual. Oh yeah, he lived with his parents. And he was playing video games and I was watching TV on my laptop. We'd ordered pizza and the pizza arrived and we sat down to eat for a bit. He then produced a ring and proposed. I saw it all flash before my eyes. Getting married and being stuck to this person for the rest of my life. I froze. Knew I didn't want to say yes, but I was too afraid to say no. Of course, he took my silence as a rejection and started screaming at me about how I was an ungrateful B-word and how could I refuse him. His parents came in and also started screaming at me for rejecting their son. I started crying, got got my purse, and ran out of the house. I didn't have my car, so I walked a block and called for an Uber. That poor Uber driver must have been wigged, picking up a girl off the side of the road, bawling her eyes out. I got home and I was shaking. Of course, he tried to call me over and over again, but I refused to speak to him for about 3 weeks. We eventually talked, and I told him I didn't want to be with a person who was so unstable, and that he needed to get professional help and get better before he and I could work. He, of course, never did, and I haven't heard from him since. We'd been together for 6 months when he proposed. We were both young at the time and weren't even living together. My gut told me right away that it was too soon, but I said yes anyway and went along with it because I thought he loved me and I loved him. I really thought that we could build a nice life together. I made it clear that I wanted to wait a while before we actually got married, but he was keen to speed things along as fast as possible. I didn't even want to tell our families about it yet because I knew they would give us grief over getting engaged so young, and only a few months of being together. As things moved along, I made it clear that I wasn't ready to get married at my age, and wanted to spend more time with him before we went through with it. He sort of threw a fit and accused me of cheating on him, because there was no other reason in his mind I could possibly want to wait to marry. Things started to get really toxic, and I eventually left him for good. I gave him the ring back and parted civilly, but he wasn't about to let it go so easily. He was calling and texting me constantly for weeks, accused me of being obsessed with him and following him around, and I started to realize that he was not in a normal state of mind. I was scared, but it calmed down after a while and things started to get back to normal. Unfortunately, he started spreading all kinds of nasty rumors about me, about how I accused him of being abusive and was abusive towards him. His entire family turned sour towards me because of it, and it was difficult because we shared most of our friends. He ruined my reputation and my self-esteem, but it made me realize that I really dodged one hell of a bullet by refusing to marry him. Every so often, he messages me on social media asking to get back together. I either don't reply or give him a polite but very firm no. This doesn't really matter, but it's another funny little detail. He gave my engagement ring to his mother as a Mother's Day gift, and now she wears it all the time. She has to know it used to belong to me, but still finds it to be a sweet gift from her insane son. Lawyers, has there ever been a time the opposing counsel accidentally proved your case for you? And what happened? My favorite is a story from Jerry Spence. For those who don't know, he's a famous trial attorney. A witness on the stand was claiming he had suffered injuries to his arm because of a city bus accident. Jerry asked him to demonstrate to the jury how far he can lift his arm after the accident. The witness makes a feeble effort of lifting his arm. Then Jerry asks the witness to demonstrate to the jury how far he could lift his arm before the accident. He lifts his arm much higher. The jury laughs and the case is over. Domestic violence case where the husband beat the wife senseless. Landlord tried to evict wife for breach of lease due to the beating. Landlord claimed wife violated lease terms by allowing police to be called to property and causing a disruption. My argument was that as a domestic violence victim, wife is covered under VAWA and the property is HUD subsidized. Also, MD law refers to domestic violence protections too. Landlord's counsel during his opening talked about how my client was beaten and the police were called in an ambulance, etc. I just stood there looking at him. When he finished, judge asked if I had anything to say. My response? No, Your Honor. I believe opposing counsel has said everything that needs to be said. Judge smiled and ruled in my client's favor. Landlord can't evict a domestic violence victim. My family did foster care for a few years, and we fell in love with the last girl we took in, now my younger sister. She was required to keep in regular touch with her emotionally and physically abusive birth mom, the intention being for them to eventually reunite. This woman was a horror. Every single time they interacted, she'd spend the duration painstakingly shredding my sister's self-confidence. My parents worked hard to establish a strong rapport and a supportive environment, and she blossomed under their care. She's one of the most resilient people I know. When the state tried to return her to her mom, she didn't want to go, so my parents made a claim for guardianship. This seemed like it would be an uphill battle. Here we were, a family of randos trying to steal a kid from her rightful mom. We were really afraid that she would have to go back, and that her crappy family would systematically undo all the hard work she'd done rebuilding her self-esteem. Fortunately, her idiot mom decided to represent herself at the guardianship hearing. I wasn't in the room, but I heard the audio recording later on, and it's incredible how thoroughly this woman shot herself in the foot. Here are some highlights. She kept trying to testify while cross-examining people. Example, would it surprise you to learn that blah blah blah? The judge called her out for this like 6 separate times, and she just kept doing it. She would admit to various incidents of emotional abuse, but then try to argue that it was all justified because her daughter was being a B-word. She'd ask witnesses, for example, and wouldn't you be angry if your daughter did XYZ? Yes or no? My personal favorite and the best example of her proving our case, it is absolutely not true that I hit my daughter with a wooden spoon. I only tried and missed. I'll prove it. I can show you the mark it left on the doorframe. Needless to say, we won guardianship. My sister never has to see that awful woman again unless she damn well pleases. I worked as an intern for a lawyer. Construction laws in France are quite strict in regard to the neighboring of historical monuments. The city was denying a permit for heavy modification of the house of our clients. They were arguing that because you could see the house from the church's bell tower, modifications were impossible. As a support, they kindly linked us to a 360 picture from said bell tower. We, as kindly, pointed to them that our client's house was indeed not visible from the top of the church. Building permit was greenlit the following day. Not a lawyer, but I am a former insurance fraud investigator. We were at a hearing before the WCB. I had something like 18 hours of video spread over a 2-week period of a claimant doing roofing work. The problem for me was that the video didn't get a clear face shot. Normally, what we like to do was get in close, show the face for a positive identification, and then zoom out. Bonus if the claimant was wearing distinctive clothing that could easily be tied to him. Because of where this guy lived, all I could do was show someone who matched his description getting out of a truck registered to him every morning. He wore a hat, he had a beard, and he had neither at the hearing. So the company lawyer is prepping me and basically letting me know to be on point, because the claimant's attorney is almost certainly going to challenge the fact that it is his client in the video. If the video got tossed, the case was lost. About 2 minutes into the hearing, claimant's attorney agrees to stipulate to the fact that it is his client in all of the video. All of it. Our attorney was shocked. That was pretty much the only leg he had to stand on. Claimant's attorney was incredibly smug right after this, like it was no big deal. Evidently, his strategy was to show that his client wasn't really a professional roofer since he was doing the roof the wrong way. He tried to get me to answer questions about roofing. I refused as it was beyond the scope of my work, and he just wouldn't let it go. After about an hour of back and forth over this, the judge finally said, "Counselor, it doesn't matter if your client is doing the work well. What matters is that he has stated numerous times and under oath that he cannot work. Whether he's doing it for free, for cash, or for fun has no bearing on the fact that he's doing roofing work while collecting compensation benefits which he was awarded because he couldn't do roofing work." The guy lost and had to repay a bunch of benefits. After a few of those hearings, I began formulating a list of lawyers I would never hire and ones I would absolutely want on my side. I had to go to court over a financial mess up when I was a student. Took advice from the university legal support team who said I didn't need a solicitor, so I went in alone. The judge didn't like this and postponed it for another date so I could prove I'd had more counsel first. The other party's solicitor caught me outside the court and said, "I didn't tell you this, but," and pointed out a huge error in the financial paperwork that made it very obviously come out in my favor. Went back to legal support, got confirmation that it was right, went to the second hearing alone, and got the entire thing thrown out. The other solicitor winked at me as he left. Saved me about $9K. Nice chap. I had a misdemeanor possession case I was defending. Client was driving his mom's car. He gets pulled over for playing the stereo too loud. There are pills in the center console, in a prescription pill bottle. The bottle has his mom's name on it. Client gets arrested and charged with possession of a controlled substance without a prescription. Case is obviously bull, and the dumbest DA I've ever met in my life won't dismiss. We go to trial. During closing arguments, the DA says, "This case is a circumstantial evidence case." During my closing, I slap the jury instruction on the projector and say that if a case is based on circumstantial evidence and there is one factual scenario that points to guilt and one that points to innocence, the jury must find in favor of the defendant and acquit. My client was acquitted. This seems like a really nasty move from the cop that arrested this kid. None of this needed to ever happen. When I first started, my firm had me on a case where the client claimed he lost because of ineffective assistance of counsel, basically saying that the old lawyer didn't do his job. So we prepare an argument based on not asking the right questions, not communicating, etc. We think it's going to be a tough case, but not unwinnable. Then we get the response to our complaint where the old lawyer argues that he was only ineffective because he didn't have time to prepare for the case, and only reviewed it the morning of the original trial. He had known about the case for months, by the way. The judge saw this, and during the trial, we had essentially asked, isn't this the definition of ineffective counsel? Not giving enough time to your client? The silence from his side of the court was amazing. Needless to say, the trial didn't last much longer than that. Thanks, opposing counsel. I guess you were ineffective for both of you. I once had a district attorney indicate to the court that if defense counsel had included this argument in his motions, it would possibly be a valid argument. I interrupted him with the page number and heading where it was located. I was an attorney for the estate of a husband defending against claims for money by the separate estate of a wife over proceeds from the sale of a business back in 1996. Both husband and wife died in 2010. Suit was filed in early 2011, went to trial in 2014. Wife got around 10% of the business in 1996. Husband got the rest. He had built and operated it for 35 years prior to marriage and sold it 7 years into the marriage. The whole case hinged on whether the valuation of the business in 1996 was reasonable or not. We say, you can't value a business 15 years later with all the documents gone and all the main people in the business dead or missing. They say they have enough info to show the 1996 valuation should have been higher. Opposing counsels get a big-time expert to testify that the business sold of $45 million based on a valuation, but should have sold for $70 million, and the husband hid $25 million in real estate in the transaction. We get that testimony and then realize the 1996 valuation of the business was done by the same expert. This is absolutely the most perfect catch-22 I have ever seen. So now we ask, okay, so was your valuation wrong in 1996 or is it wrong now? Expert says his 1996 valuation was right based on the information he had in 1996, but his valuation now is more correct, which then bears the question, what kind of information do you have now that you didn't have in 1996?
I don't know. I don't have my file from 1996. Nobody keeps documents that long.
And despite this lack of records, his valuation is somehow more correct now. Judge basically said the expert was talking out of both sides of his butt and we won. When I first started practicing, I handled a custody case where my client, mom, had a problem with dad smoking around the kids. I asked him if he regularly smoked around the kids, to which he replied that he doesn't smoke tobacco, only weed in the house. Obviously, this raised eyebrows as it is illegal in my state. He then went into a long diatribe about how he only follows the law of the streets. He actually said this, and doesn't recognize the authority of the court he was currently in front of. Needless to say, mom got full custody, especially after dad was arrested for going to the court service officer's house late at night and trying to kick her door in. My public defender wife was trying a case where the defendant was accused of filling fraudulent prescriptions. Now, keep in mind that public defenders deal with a lot of shady characters who maintain their innocence with increasingly implausible stories as the evidence gets worse. So you can get a bit jaded after a while, but you don't have to believe your client's story to represent them vigorously. So the prosecution has grainy surveillance video of someone who looks like the defendant getting the prescription filled and the ID used to fill it, which belongs to the defendant. Defendant maintains that someone stole his ID and is using it because they look similar, and never reported the ID as stolen. My wife is skeptical that the jury will go for that, but she's always willing to go to trial if that's what the client wants. So preps that defense and heads into trial. Prosecutor brings in the pharmacist who reported the prescription issue, goes through the usual routine of establishing who she is, where she works, was this ID used that day, etc. Finally, the prosecutor asks the pharmacist if the person who attempted to fill the prescription that day is in the courtroom. No. Oops. My opposing counsel made some off-the-cuff remarks about how their client had to go to another remote office to get all the records they wanted to use against my client. That let me know the witness they were trying to use to introduce the records as evidence wasn't actually familiar with the records or the records-keeping process. In the jurisdiction we were in, records were exemption to hearsay rule, but you needed someone familiar with the creation and maintenance of the records to get them admitted. I attacked the witness's qualifications to get the records admitted and ended up getting the records excluded. I then made a motion for a directed verdict on the grounds they couldn't prove the case without the records, and won, all because the opposing counsel complained that their witnesses had to go way out of their way to get the records for the court. I had a hearing where the opposing party offered an updated contract that my client supposedly signed, except it was a horrible copy and barely readable. Then he assured the judge that the new contract was exactly the same as the old contract, except for the party name at the top. The original contract was in his mom's name, the new one in his name, and the date of the contract itself. He made that assurance multiple times. After he exhausted himself saying how everything was the same, I pointed out to the judge that half the provisions were different and that my client had never signed that form. The judge asked if we were really accusing him of forging my client's signature, since that's a serious accusation. I held up the guy's prior conviction for contract fraud and said, "I absolutely am, Your Honor. We won. Hands down, no further argument needed." I was about 5 when this happened, but my parents explained it years later. There was a series of trees on the sidewalk in front of each house on the street. Although they were not part of our yard, the tree was owned by my parents and they were responsible for it. Some guy tripped over a branch and was seriously injured. He came after my parents for all of the money. The dude showed up with a mountain of evidence: hospital bills, psychologist testimonials, a photo montage of his slow and painful recovery, etc. Apparently, his lawyer brandished this stuff like a bat before court. My parents' lawyer thought he had a good case, until the first day of court, when he walked over with a picture and asked, "Is this your tree?" My parents looked at the photo in disbelief. "No, that's actually not our tree." The opposing counsel repeated the question. It went back and forth a few times until my parents' lawyer incredulously provided a picture of their tree, which was, even to the untrained eye, a completely different tree. At that point, the opposing counsel whirled around and started screaming at his client, "You said it was their tree!" Case summarily dismissed. My parents walked out in shock, came home, and bought me ice cream. All's well that ends well. Plaintiff was claiming insurance money because he accidentally chopped off his fingers while cutting bamboo with a machete, and the insurance company, our client, refused to pay the insured amount. During the hearing, the plaintiff attorney began to demonstrate with a rolled up sheet of paper how his client was cutting the bamboo when the accident happened. No matter how he tried, he could not reproduce the position of the fingers with the alleged cut of the machete. The only possible match would be if the plaintiff had deliberately extended his fingers over a plane surface and hacked his own fingers. Based on this disastrous performance, the judge determined an expert opinion was needed and later dismissed the case due to deliberate self-mutilation. Parents were being sued by their landlord, and parents had a countersuit against him. Parents were moving across country and found this house to rent. They did a walkthrough and everything looks great. Landlord wants first, last, security, and $1,500 because they had a dog and 2 cats. Fine. It was somewhere in the $8,000 to $9,000 range. No big deal for them. They're set to move in on a Monday, so my mom flies in on Saturday to do one final look over, sign the contract, and get the key. Perfect. They are now the tenants. Monday, they arrive, and the house is trashed. The landlord has moved a bunch of his stuff into the garage, shed, and one of the bedrooms. There's stool in the toilet, pee on the floor, garbage laying everywhere, used condoms. I can't really do this justice, but my mom took pictures and videos throughout the entire house. She calls the landlord and tells him they are not moving in with the house in this condition. He tells her to clean the house and he'll buy the first tank of oil for the house. It was empty. Tells her to do it or he's keeping all of the money for breach of contract. A lot of back and forth happens and ton of harassing texts and phone calls from him. Court day comes and everyone's ready to submit their evidence in front of the judge. Parents have photos, texts, the contract, videos. Landlord only has a contract. But his contract is different than my parents'. He's included a section that states they permit him access to the house for his storage needs, and that the tenant is responsible for all on-site cleanup and maintenance after accepting the key. The best part was that the date of the signatures on his contract was the date they moved in, not the date my mom flew in and signed. Judge tells the landlord he's a special level of stupid, and then the judge's final remarks were about how disrespectful the landlord was to show up in shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and flip-flops in his courtroom. He never paid a dime, then claimed bankruptcy, and started a business under a different name. 2 years later, I went to his house, let out all but 19 PSI from all of his tires, and superglued the caps on the valve stems. I do only civil litigation. You would think it would generally be a battle against equals, professionals versus professionals. It's not. I face a fair amount of parties representing themselves pro se, often otherwise smart people who wouldn't think to do their own plumbing or operate on their own appendix, but have no qualms about appearing in court on their own behalf. Surprisingly, they don't know what they're doing. One of my favorites from a deposition:
"We didn't pay Company X's invoices because we heard they were going through bankruptcy."
A, they weren't, and B, it wouldn't be a valid defense to non-payment if they had been. It happens more often than you would think. One attorney that people continue to hire, Brian, is sort of a legend. As opposing counsel 4 times in 6 years, he's lost cases against my firm where he could have won. This is civil litigation, but the guy has a knack for spoiling his momentum. One in particular, the evidence pointed that our client was at fault and we were asked to settle. Brian introduced a witness and voicemail to the record. We had no knowledge of these and asked to review. Upon review, we were confused as the voicemail had nothing to do with proving their case, and made the plaintiff look like a lunatic. It was full of incoherent rambling and swearing. We allowed the exhibits to be entered and they went over as we expected, and we won the counterclaim. A guy ended up taking my family to court basically because he'd been dating my mother and things ended. So he then takes us to small claims court with an itemized list of everything he'd ever bought the entire family. Every cheeseburger, every Kit Kat. He even billed for things he did, like house repairs. Some of the repairs were terrible and ruined other things. He tried to unclog the sink and ended up destroying the main drain pipe for the house. Now, he had bought some more expensive things as well. No one asked him to, but he was one of the types that loved to show how much money he had and would always talk about his connections and would name drop someone anytime we went anywhere. So when he takes us to court with his full itemized list, the judge asks him to go first to present his testimony. He basically says, "While I was with them, I bought all this stuff. I took them to dinner all the time and all this, but it was the idea it would be paid back by them." Judge: you bought a child a birthday cake with the idea it would be paid back? Did you ever say that these things were loans and not gifts? Him: well, no, but I shouldn't need to. That's the normal way people think. Judge: well, that's not the way I'd think. Case dismissed. I didn't prosecute this case, but I saw it. The state was prosecuting an individual for reckless conduct with a deadly weapon and criminal threatening with a deadly weapon. It was a bench trial because the defendant was a foreigner, and I guess the defendant was concerned that a jury would be biased against him. Essentially, the state alleged that the defendant waved a gun at 2 employees of a Dairy Queen and then discharged the gun in the air. The defendant was the manager of the Dairy Queen. So at the start of the case, the state requested a continuance because it could not produce the 2 employees. They had been subpoenaed but didn't show. The judge denied the continuance, so the state decided to go forward. It put on its case but wasn't able to introduce any testimony that the defendant brandished the gun at the employees or that he had discharged it near them. There were admissions that he had a gun that night, which he had shown to other people, and testimony that the gun had been discharged. State rests. Defense does not move to dismiss and calls the defendant to the stand. I was watching in the gallery with some public defenders because trials were uncommon in that county. We immediately begin whispering to each other about how he didn't make the motion to dismiss at halftime. The defendant testifies about how he wanted to scare the 2 employees as a joke. Then, on cross, he testifies how he brandished the gun and what angle he was holding it when he fired. Defense rests. The judge had the longest delivery of verdict that I have ever heard. He said something to the effect of, "It's rare that you find a defendant that convicts himself by his own testimony, but that is what happened here. Without the testimony regarding the gun and the discharge, there would be insufficient evidence to convict." He goes on and on. While the judge was delivering the verdict, the defendant was standing, obviously. He faints and slams his head on the defendant's table. He ultimately was taken out of the courtroom on a stretcher and transported to a local hospital. There was blood all over the floor. The defense attorney, who was in his mid-60s, looked like he needed medical attention too. This would have been an instant ineffective assistance of counsel, but he was immediately deported, which is the main reason he went to trial, because he was also a convicted felon, though not charged with felon in possession in this case. And INS was only waiting for the conviction to deport him, so he was sent back to his home country. This was the most messed up thing I've seen in court, and have seen some wild stuff. I felt bad for the attorney, but ultimately contacted lawyers' assistants about him because I saw saw him do other things that were almost as bad. As a prosecutor, I was worried about his clients, who were paying him for the most part as the court was no longer appointing cases to him, and his ability to effectively represent them. Doctors of Reddit? What was a symptom a patient didn't mention that was really important? 16-year-old came in with blood pressure of 60/30, pale as a ghost, tons of free fluid in his abdomen on ultrasound. Turns out he had a metastatic testicular cancer that had eroded into his aorta and was bleeding into his belly. Come to find out later, he had testicle lumps and was too scared to tell anyone. I had a guy come to the hospital who told me he had seizures every Tuesday like clockwork. This is highly unusual for somebody with a seizure disorder. It wasn't until I asked him about his social history that he told me he's a heavy drinker. I further investigated, and it turns out he binge drinks Thursday, Friday, Saturday every week, then stops cold turkey. He was having withdrawal seizures. Black stools. Folks, if you're having black poops, for God's sake, mention that sooner rather than later. This lady had been seeing nothing but black for months before she thought to mention anything. We found several gastric ulcers and a hemoglobin level that circled the drain. Medical intern here. Had a woman come to ER complaining about stomach pain. Took her full history, did the exam and vitals. She seemed fine, mild fever. Made a preliminary diagnosis of gastrointestinus and presented to my doctor. My doctor, who's female, goes to her and asks why she came to the ER for something so mild. She says because she noticed blood in her stool. The doc comes out and asks me if I asked about her stool. I did, and she said it was fine. And I asked specifically about blood. She goes back in and asks the patient why she didn't mention that to me, and her response, "I didn't think it was appropriate to say it to a male intern." Turns out she had ulcerative colitis, needed a colonoscopy and long-term medical therapy and possibly surgery. Guys, when it comes to medical professionals, don't feel the need to be ashamed. I can almost guarantee they have seen or heard way worse than whatever you have to tell them. I had a patient whose main complaint was a wrist sprain. Asked how he fell, and he said he felt lightheaded and fell down the stairs. After about 15 minutes of questions about his heart and other stuff, I asked him if he's had any vomiting. He said he vomits every day. I ask if it's red, and he says it's bright red every time. The kicker is, this was his usual yearly appointment. Dude was vomiting blood every day, and not only did not go to the ER, he didn't feel it was worth mentioning at his checkup. Chest pain. Guy denied ever having chest pain. Ever. Told us he was able to chop wood and work on his land without any issues. He didn't meet any criteria for additional workup prior to surgery. During his major surgery, he had a huge heart attack. A cardiac cath showed that he basically had one very narrow coronary artery that was the only thing getting blood to his heart. His daughters, who were nurses, all swore up and down that he was healthy as a horse and never complained of heart issues. Then his black sheep other daughter arrived and said he actually had told her that he has terrible exertional chest pain every time he did anything, but that he didn't want his daughters to know because they would worry. He died a few days later. If we had known about his symptoms, he would have likely had his cardiac disease diagnosed and treated prior to surgery. I had a patient who needed a small sterile procedure done but had a latex allergy, and it was in bright red all over her chart. We used paper charts back then. We had just ran out of latex-free sterile gloves. I went in to tell her she needed to come back in a week when we got them back. Then I decided to ask what happened when she came into contact with latex. Her response? "I get chlamydia." I'm sorry. What? What is this story? Is this woman serious? Did my sub-I on a level 1 trauma ED a few years ago as a 4th-year med student. Homeless guy with Hep B, Hep C, and HIV came in talking about a rash on his shoulder. How it hurt, had been pretty hot out, and that was where he was slinging his bag on. Looked okay, figured it was for a sweat rash, he was really in there for food, so was going to give him some cream and a sandwich and send him out the door. Was about to leave when I looked at his chief complaint again, and it also had testicular pain. So I asked him what was going on with his testicles. Lifts up the gown, and he has a tracking abscess through his scrotal skin and through one of his testicles. It was like a worm burrowing through an apple.
Oh, I guess it's okay.
Ended up calling urology and infectious disease, and the guy ended up leaving against medical advice because we were making him NPO, without food, in anticipation of surgery. I'm a med student, and on my family medicine rotation, I was sent to see this woman before the doctor and get a history and physical. She was saying she was having heartburn and just wanted us to give her something to throw up so she would feel better. I thought it was odd, and so I went through some more review questions, and she said her reflux pain was extending up the left side of her neck and down her left arm, and that she'd been sweating for hours. I cut off my interview short there and went to my teaching doctor to tell him everything and what I thought. Got an EKG. Yeah, she was having a heart attack. Had to call an ambulance and get her to the ER. Had a guy who was sent in because his family was concerned about him, mainly because he was getting into a lot of physical altercations. Appointment with the patient was normal. He was able to talk himself out of most issues his family stated were occurring. And as we were ending, he said he had to pick up his other truck from the shop. I asked him, "Oh, you own 2 trucks?" He replied, "I own 5 trucks." The guy was military and only made 60 to 70K a year. Come to find out, he had bipolar disorder, and in his manic episodes, he would just take out a large loan to buy a new truck. He had almost 120K in debt in just trucks. If it wasn't for that last part of him mentioning he was getting his truck, I would have sent him home and probably never known he had a psychiatric issue. Saw a patient during a follow-up for a gynecological cancer. She said she felt great. Exam was normal. She was relieved, but she was so anxious it set off my medical spider sense, so to speak. I decided to push a bit further, which led to this conversation. "So, you said you felt good? Absolutely nothing else bothering you?" "Oh, you know, some small things. Nothing having anything to do with this." "Well, why don't you tell me anyway?" "Well, I kind of have this weird lump on my belly. A sweat gland or greasy nodule or something. Doesn't really bother me, but I might get a dermatologist to have a look at it if it ever needs to be removed." "Ah, I see. Could you show it to me?" She showed me, and I saw a skin metastasis, clear as day. Don't know how the story ended because I moved to different service immediately after. But if I had to guess, her life expectancy was probably measured in months. Admitted a baby my intern year that had transferred to our facility for persistent vomiting following a surgery on a part of the intestinal tract. The transferring facility had wanted us to start the baby on a form of intravenous nutrition and offhandedly mentioned some low-grade laboratory abnormalities that they had attributed to the baby just having had surgery. I go into the room in the middle of the night, the first representative of our medical team to meet the family, and in the process of gathering the history, ask the family what color the baby's poop was. The family replied that it was white or gray and had been since birth, and that they just thought that's how it should be. Record scratch. Big red flag. We ultimately diagnosed the baby with a rare genetic disorder that required an organ transplant. A few months ago, a woman, 36 years old, consulted to endocrinology because she was getting fat without a change in her diet and she felt different. Asking more questions, she casually mentioned she hadn't had her menstruation for months and that maybe she was menopausic. At 36, we suggested that she might be pregnant and she said it was a stupid idea and that she knew she was not pregnant. We did some analysis and ecography and yep, 35 weeks pregnant. You give birth at around 40. I was once rounding on a patient in the morning that had come in for a stroke. I decided to ask some basic review of the symptoms questions just out of habit. And when I asked about changes in vision, he said yes. I probed further and he told me that he was using eye drops for something, but that he forgot his eye drops at home 3 days ago when he came to the hospital. For the last 3 days, the vision in his left eye was worsening along with eye pain and pressure. When I called his pharmacy to see what drops he was using, as I suspected, they were for glaucoma, and he was having worsening vision loss due to untreated glaucoma, increasing his intraocular pressure. We got a no pathology consult stat. Medic here ran a call to a general sick person call and arrived to find a slender lady in her 80s. She wasn't feeling well and her granddaughter finally called 911. We run through our assessment and aren't finding much to go on. And then, me. Anything happened recently, like a fall or a trip or something like that?
Well, I fell a few days ago and hit my head, but I wasn't feeling bad until a couple hours ago.
Oh, okay. And you took all of your meds since the fall?
Well, no, I didn't take them yesterday, just today.
This morning, like usual?
Well, no, I took them around 2 hours ago.
Including the blood thinner? Oh, shnikes. Yelled to the other guys to grab the gurney. I didn't even need her to answer. I knew exactly what was happening the second she told me she took her meds right before she started feeling off. Subdural bleed. Didn't even matter how fast we drove, and we drove fast. She lost consciousness shortly after we got to the ER and probably never regained it. The blood thinner accelerated the bleed and she expired from it. It was such a terrible situation. Her granddaughter was really confused and scared at the sudden shift in our demeanor. It was such a large bleed and textbook case presentation that it was used as a case study for our quality improvement training. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I had an elderly gentleman come in because he fell in his kitchen. Didn't lose consciousness or anything. Didn't have any signs of trauma, but both eyes were slightly swollen, which he had said happened before the fall. Oh, and he forgot to tell me he also had a sore throat. He wouldn't have even brought it up if I hadn't asked why his voice sounded a little muffled. Took a close look at his throat. He had some pretty significant pharyngeal edema. He ended up having what's called angioedema, which explains the throat and eye swelling. Different from an allergic reaction. He ended up getting intubated and sedated and went to the ICU to protect his airway. He initially came in because of a completely inconsequential fall and got intubated and admitted to the ICU because of an "oh, by the way, doc" moment. Not a people doctor, but I worked as a vet tech for 3 years. Had a little tiny mini shih tzu in horrible health with a nasty attitude to match. You could seriously barely touch the dog, and she was very, very sick. The only reason we were able to do anything for her was because she was so small. The owner comes to visit her one afternoon and casually mentions to us that she's deaf. Poor thing was scared out of her mind and did remarkably better once we learned to let her know we were there before touching her. As a primary care doctor, we try to keep to our tight schedules. It can be difficult when patients could come in with something complex or with a shopping list of things that they want to talk about. And balancing this with providing good care and being mindful that the next patient will be waiting in 15 minutes for their appointment, we can be notorious for being late for these reasons. I saw a patient the other day who said she had a runny nose. I just got on with it, made sure she didn't have any signs of a more serious illness, and gave her some advice on what to do. After that, she also had a pain in her ankle she quickly wanted checked out. I couldn't find much wrong and assured her it would probably be okay in a couple days. Now her 15 minutes is up and I'm kinda gesturing her that we're finished. Then she pauses and says, "Okay, I just wanted to get those things checked out. The main reason I'm here is that I've been having chest pain all morning." God, I face-palmed. I had a patient come in with a neck mass. There was enough off that he got the beginnings of a malignancy and infection workup that was remarkable for the mass being a hematoma. Then he remembered he was in a car accident and the seatbelt was where said mass was. I was discharging an elderly man in a wheelchair who had been treated for a urinary tract infection. At the end of the conversation, I suddenly realized, somewhat embarrassingly, that nothing in his papers told me why he was in a wheelchair. So I asked, "Why are you in a wheelchair?"
Because I can't walk.
He answered, "Well, fine, but why can't you walk?"
I don't know.
Okay, how long have you been in a wheelchair?
Since I was admitted last Sunday.
Okay. At some point, everybody in health experiences how difficult it can be to get information from patients. A good tip is to ask specific questions. So I followed up with, "Did you have any problems walking a month ago?"
Oh, no problems. I went for daily walks.
At this point, I had to get up and do a neurological exam, and found almost total loss of motoric and sensoric function in the lower extremities. Turns out he had a metastatic cancer compressing his spinal cord, and since he hadn't mentioned his quickly deteriorating legs, he had just been put in a wheelchair at admission with no further questions asked. As a kid, I was always out of breath and could hardly do any physical activity. When I would run or laugh hard or go up the stairs, my arms and legs would tingle. Thought I mentioned that to my parents a few times, but at the doctor, all that was ever said was I wasn't very active. Ended up passing out in gym class at age 8 and being diagnosed with a cardiovascular problem about a month before it would have killed me. The tingling and dizziness should have been a good clue. Not so much a symptom, but a medication missing from their health records that produced symptoms of poor bone grafting. In my dental office, and basically any dental office, we ask you to fill out a health history form and sign it. We'll again ask you at x-rays about any medications or health concerns. We will again ask you about what medications you're taking before any procedures. We will ask you again each and every time you visit the office, even if we just saw you yesterday as your last appointment. This man came in for several implants. This has multiple stages, which means multiple visits. We asked countless times upon each visit about his health records, health history, and medication. Nothing. Okay, that's great. But guess who had many failed implants, pain, and bone issues develop? Every implant failed. We only found out what the heck was going on when we were scratching our heads trying to understand why a healthy person was having bone problems, and asked him if it was fine for us to contact his physician, and from his physician we found out about his medication and made the connections right away. The medication he was on greatly prevents proper bone health. We would have changed our entire treatment plan if he had mentioned his medication he was taking. We even explained the treatment plan several times and asked if there were health problems so many times, and he stated no health problems. At least if he had stated a health problem, we could have researched what medications are used for it and prevented issues. He required bone grafting, and proper bone health is imperative. He spent thousands and then blamed us. He's forcing our doctor to do thousands of free work on damages because of his mistake. So much money, pain, and problems could have been prevented if this man just told us what damn pill he fed himself each night before bed. I'm an EMS worker, and one day my 62-year-old neighbor calls me up and tells me to bring my blood pressure thingy. She's a retired cop and one of the coolest people you'll ever hope to meet. She's also stubborn as a mule, so I'm thinking immediately that if she's asking me for a once-over, things are not swell. So I head up with my cuff and stethoscope and ask her what's up. She tells me she's felt off for a few days, dizzy at odd times and exhausted. I take her blood pressure as she's sitting in her chair, and it's fairly normal, but she's still acting off. Her eyes are red-rimmed, she's pale, and then I notice a bruise on her chin. I ask her about it. She tells me about getting up to go to the bathroom the night before, and the last thing she recalled was walking back into her bedroom. She woke up later on the floor. In my world, that's just cause for a ride in our Weep-Whoop mobile. But again, we're not dealing with your average little old lady. So I'm essentially now trying to convince her gently that she needs a doctor's opinion. I did a couple of quick tests to rule out a stroke, and she passed with flying colors. I do a postural, where someone goes from sitting to standing and you check their blood pressure to see if they're compensating, and she's down a solid 20 points, but is of course playing it down as not a big deal. As we're negotiating, I tell her, look, you wouldn't call me up here for nothing, so we need to figure this out. Then it finally comes out. She's had dark and tarry stools and vomit. Well, that was the end of negotiation. Ambulance was called and she was rushed to the ER, where she was immediately given a blood transfusion because of a massive GI bleed. I'm still surprised her blood pressure was within normal ranges both times, but I've chalked it up to the amount of vinegar she has in her. Guys, I had to say Weep-Whoop mobile like 15 times because I couldn't say it without laughing. Nurse here. Had a man come in complaining of urinary retention, which could be because of his age. He left out the weakness and numbness in his legs that had been going on for almost a month during all of his assessments. These assessments were by both doctors, urologists, and nurses. He always denied any other symptoms besides urinary retention. He suddenly stopped being able to feel or move below his belly button. MRI of his back showed cancer into his spinal column, and he died 8 months later. So, triage nurse doing phone triage. Member had high blood pressure, 180/90, due to not taking blood pressure pills. This was not outside her unmedicated baseline. I asked if she was having shortness of breath or chest pain. She said no. Booked her a same-day appointment after talking with her provider. She was having a heart attack with both chest pains and breathing issues when she came to her appointment. Don't lie, people, seriously. I don't understand why you would seek out medical attention and then not be honest about the symptoms that you're having. You're not doing yourself any favors. You clearly came here for a reason. Speak up. Exhaustion. Not just being really tired at the end of the day, but unable to function exhaustion. I would wake up in the morning and then 2 hours later need to take a nap that would sometimes last until 3 or 5 in the afternoon. I told my doctor and she ran blood tests, thinking it was my thyroid, but nothing came back abnormal. I was 29 years old. She kind of shrugged and figured it was hormones. A few months later, I noticed rectal bleeding. Went back to the doctor to be told it was hemorrhoids and just waited out. Turns out it was stage 3 rectal cancer. I was cancer-free for almost 3 years until it reappeared in my lung. Now I'm stage 4 and about to begin immunotherapy. I'm lucky because my disease is regulated to only a tiny spot, and I have a rare mutation that qualifies me for immunotherapy, but it's still an absolutely terrifying situation. Feeling extremely tired all the time is one of the first notable symptoms of some cancers. Please don't let your doctors ignore it. Kind of tying back to what one of our previous posters said, unfortunately, yes, a lot of the times these doctors are on a tight schedule and need to get to their next patient as quickly as possible. It's not that they don't care or aren't looking close enough, it's just that they feel a lot of stress due to their time constraints. And especially with something like exhaustion, I feel like it's very easy to go unnoticed. We all have to be careful and keep an eye out for ourselves. If you feel like something is wrong, talk to your doctor. Doctors and nurses of Reddit who have delivered babies to mothers who clearly cheated on their husbands, what was that like? We had a very sweet, blonde-haired, blue-eyed mom and dad along with their entire extended family in the room for a delivery one busy afternoon at work. Think aunts, uncles, cousins, grandma, and grandpa too. The baby's born, and as the doctor places her on the mom's chest, the first words out of her mouth are, "That's not my baby! That's not my baby!" The baby in question, still attached at the umbilical cord, has beautiful, dark, curly black hair and dark skin. The nurse looks at her and tells her that this is definitely her baby because she's still attached to you. And she, not so quietly, tells the nurse, "There's no way! I never slept with a black man. It's not mine." The father is standing there silent, not sure what to do. A long, awkward silence fills the room. We clean her and the baby up as cheerfully as we can. We see the extended family filter out of the room and the father leaves to get a cigarette. About 10 minutes later, a tall black guy walks up to our front desk asking how to get to the patient in question's room. Okay, I am a nurse, but this story isn't about a birth I witnessed, it was my own birth. And although my mother definitely didn't cheat, all the midwives were convinced she had. For background, my mother's white and got married young to another white guy. Actually forced to by my grandparents who were horrified since she was living in sin. Their relationship petered out and they separated, but remained very good friends. Then she met my father, a black man, and began a relationship with him. Mum was still married at the time. Neither her nor her husband were in a hurry to get divorced, and he became good friends with Mum's new partner, my dad. Mum got pregnant with me. Time moves along. She goes into labor and needs to head to the hospital. Dad was working and couldn't make it home in time to get her there. So, still being good friends with the husband, she rings him and he comes around to drive her to the hospital and decides to hang out until I'm born. After an hour or so, Dad arrives. He was freaking out a bit, so his best friend, who was another black guy, drove him because Dad didn't trust himself. They arrive at the hospital right as Mom is ready to deliver. The midwives come out to the waiting room and grab the husband to be there when the baby's born. They knew that my mom's technical husband had driven her there, so assumed that he was the father of the baby. Went and grabbed him and tried to drag him into the delivery room. He freaked out and yelled, No, I'm not the father, I'm just the husband. The father's Aboriginal." Dad and his friend pulled up into the car park as this is happening, and Dad leaps out of the car. Decides he needs to have a quick smoke to settle his nerves before coming in. His friend doesn't smoke, so he walks in ahead. Just then, the midwives come running back to the waiting room to grab the actual father and see the only black guy in there. Obviously him, right? So they take him and suit him up to bring him to delivery. For whatever reason, my dad's friend chose not to question this and just went along with it. The midwives reach the delivery room and shove him inside. Mom, legs in stirrups and at the pushing stage, goes absolutely ballistic. "Not that black guy, he's not the father, go get the other one." The midwives hustle my dad's friend out and return him to the waiting room to wait with the husband. My dad has finally come inside by now, and the midwives marched up to him and said something like, "I hope you're the father this time, otherwise I'm just going to give up and she can give birth alone." So that's the story about how the hospital went through 3 different men before they actually found my father. Consulted a couple who were expecting a baby and were confused about how she had chlamydia. Again. Turns out they both had chlamydia. Both got treated and continued doing their thing. She could not get her head around how she had it again if he was the only guy she had slept with. He just looked very sheepish as I tried to subtly explain maybe he had caught it from elsewhere and passed it on. Took a long time for the penny to drop. One of those couples where you realize the kid won't get any help with their science homework from their parents. I know a guy who's fully white. His parents are both white and his younger sister's black. I always assumed she was adopted, and one day I mentioned it. He looked at me weirdly and was like, "No dude, that's my full-blood sister." Obviously, I didn't believe it, and neither did his dad at the birth. But they got the paternity test and she was his daughter. Likelihood is they've got some black ancestors far enough back to be forgotten about. I also know a dude who has a white Scottish mom and a black Jamaican dad. Dude came out pale white with a ginger afro. Genetics were not on his side. Anesthesiologist here. C-sections are typically done under spinal anesthesia, and we're the ones at the head of the table keeping the mother calm and talking her through the procedure while the surgeons operate. I've seen it more than once, but I remember one in particular where the parents were both very Caucasian and the baby was very much not. The father obviously had to be very dark-skinned. At delivery, when the not father saw the baby, he just looked down at his wife, who started to cry and calmly called her some horrible names and walked out. She started screaming for him to come back, but there wasn't much she could do since she was, still being operated on. She lost it to the point I eventually had to sedate her just a bit because she was in danger of injuring herself. As far as I know, her husband never came back to the hospital. I don't know what happened after that. A friend of mine tells the story of his aunt giving birth in the 70s or 80s to a baby that at first glance appeared to be of Asian descent. Aunt and her husband are both Caucasian Midwesterners from long lines of the same sort, going back to Germany. There was evidently a shocked moment, and then the aunt's father, my friend's grandfather, quipped,
"Well, they say 1 in 7 babies is born Chinese."
And everyone laughed. The tension broke, long enough for the doctor, also a white Midwesterner of German stock, said that likely the kid's color is just off due to the events of the birth. The baby is now a man in his 30s or 40s and looks like your typical Midwesterner. He just had some tinge to his skin for a few hours following the birth, plus some dark hair at birth that has since lightened up. I had a case where the newborn had chlamydia. Got it from the mom, obviously. So the mom admits that she was cheating on the dad, because there's no way to explain that one. Except the dad was cheating too, with the other guy's girlfriend. And all 4 of them had chlamydia and no idea who had it first. They also had no idea who the actual dad was. That was a rodeo. My brother had a surprise baby this way. He and a coworker had a one-night stand while she was broken up with her ex. She gets back with her ex, ends up pregnant. Flash forward to the delivery day. The day my brother sends me a picture of a random baby out of the blue and says, "I think I'm a dad." She's white, her boyfriend is black, my brother is white. Baby came out looking very, very white. I don't know how it went down in the hospital room, but I know they separated very soon after. My brother went to visit her in the hospital and asked if she would let him take a paternity test. She agreed and it came back positive a week later. And that's how I got my surprise nephew. I'm of Irish descent, extremely pale, freckled, wavy dark hair, and darker green eyes. My husband is half Native American, half German, dark hair, and slightly wavy as well. My daughter came out with light brown curly hair and ever so slight strawberry blonde pieces mixed throughout. Curls for days. And the nurse goes, "Wow, where did you get that hair?" Knowing I had similar color as a baby and my mother has kinky curly hair, my husband in a room full of nurses goes, "I don't know, poster, where did she get that hair?" I could have killed him. Not a nurse, but my wife is, and I hear everything. A woman was delivering her white ex-husband's baby with her new black boyfriend beside her. And after the baby came out and had his foot stamped with the ink pad, the boyfriend pointed to the black foot and said, "Aw, he's got my feet." I guess it's off topic, but I laughed when she told me. My brother married a half Korean, half white woman who had 3 girls to the same Mexican guy. The first looks Latina. The second looks Pacific Islander. The third girl has platinum blonde hair and icy blue eyes. They look nothing alike, and yet if you look at their lineage, it all makes sense. I don't know if this ever caused any issues between her and her ex, but I could understand if an eyebrow was raised in the third one. Now she is a 4th girl with my brother, and she looks nothing like the other 3. Just standard brown hair, brown-eyed white girl. Not a delivery nurse, but I have to share. My friend Sarah was pregnant and her boyfriend flaked out and was not in the picture. So her other friend Eric and I took it upon ourselves to be there for her during the pregnancy. When she was having an ultrasound, we were both there in the room with her. As the tech is showing us the baby's face, we're saying things like, "Dude, that's totally your nose. Look, that can't be my chin," and things like that. Sarah was laughing and the bewildered tech was looking at the three of us, probably making comparisons herself. I ended up working with that tech years later. One day she said, "So, out of curiosity, who was the father?" I'm a nurse. I've seen quite a few situations where dad turns out not to be dad, but never because of the color of the newborn. I have, however, seen an absolute ton of kids who are born and don't look like the same ethnicity as their parents for days, or sometimes a couple weeks. Babies often look darker when they're born. Just saying, some of these anecdotal stories might not necessarily be true. I had a female patient come in with abdominal pain. Pregnancy test was positive. She was with her husband who evidently had a vasectomy about a year prior. I slowly backed out of the room after that one. I know it's possible, just improbable. Obligatory, not a doctor or nurse, but both my parents have blonde hair, and when I was born, my hair was strawberry blonde. My paternal grandparents lost their heads and accused my mom of cheating because red-tinted hair didn't run in their family. However, it ran in my mom's family with a redhead popping up every now and then. My paternal grandparents didn't know that. They just really hated my mom, so looked for excuses to drag her down. It wasn't until I stopped looking like a potato, as most newborns do, and started looking like a person when my dad's family features came through enough to make them apologize to my mom. A friend of mine, white guy, never knew who his father was, got married and had a kid with a white girl. Kid came out black, so he opted for a paternity test rather than walking away, and it was indeed his son. So he took a genetics test a couple years later and it turns out he's half African. Had a patient come into the ER for a UTI with her boyfriend of 3 months. His words. She was 19, acting extremely dramatic for just having a UTI. We tell her we need urine. She urges us to cath her, which is really unusual, but says she can't pee. So me and another nurse assume the position to put in a catheter with her lying on the gurney. At this point, the nurse screams, "Call L&D, she's crowning!" L&D nurse gets in just in time to grab the child as it shoots out into her hands and is a living, breathing baby. The girl swears she had no idea she was pregnant. They wheel her off to postpartum and the guy is just kind of left standing there, dumbstruck.
"We've only been dating for 4 months. I had no idea she was pregnant. She never mentioned it at all."
All with his head just buried in his knees while he was sitting on the floor against the hallway wall. I felt so bad for the guy. Okay, so story from a friend of my brother's. She worked as a nurse and a woman and her husband came in. They were both white, and she's delivering a child that was black. The husband immediately starts saying WTF, while she's going on and on about dormant traits and everything. He orders a DNA test. While this is going on, her mother and stepdad show up. The stepdad is black. After the testing is done, the DNA test ends up showing that the baby is the stepdad's. Her husband instantly dropped her and cut ties. It's sometimes best not to leap to conclusions too quickly. When I was born, my skin was a little blue. Thankfully, my dad didn't get angry and accuse my mom of screwing around with a Smurf. Not a doctor or nurse, but in undergrad I had a buddy, Caucasian, who'd been dating the same girl, also Caucasian, for quite a while. She gets pregnant and he proposes. Fast forward a few months and both families are eagerly waiting at the hospital to greet the baby. The baby comes out black. Everyone's in shock. Girls frantically trying to convince everyone that there's been a misunderstanding. My buddy calls off the engagement immediately, returned the ring, and never looked back. Not a doctor or nurse, but when I was 14, maybe 15, I found out my cousin and his wife were having a baby. Keep in mind, my mom had lots of much older siblings, so my cousin was already 23 at this point. Fast forward 8 months later, me, mom, and the rest of our extended family are eagerly waiting outside the delivery room, and we hear a scream. Not my cousin's wife, but my cousin. The nurse opens the door for us, and we see my cousin sitting on a chair, his head in his hands. His wife is holding their baby in her hands, but the only thing was, the baby was black. Needless to say, they divorced a month later and we've not heard from her since. Med student here. Had a mother who was A negative and a father who was A negative, but baby ended up being A positive. Mother was asking if it was possible for this to happen, and the doctor kind of implied that it was possible, to my surprise, since it's not meant to be. But they suggested to retest the husband's blood group and to follow up with their general practitioner. The doctor told me after that they didn't want to get involved, and would leave it up to the general practitioner to deal with and just hope the husband was actually positive. Apparently things got awkward the next day. They stayed for a couple of days after due to complications, when the husband was asking about blood grouping and was just strongly suggested to get retested. I never found out what happened after, but from my impression of the mother and some of the things she said, I'm pretty sure she cheated. My wife's best friend is a doctor who delivers babies, so I have a couple of stories for you. She delivered one baby where the father and mother were acting really awkward, but he was around during labor, and when it came time to push, the man just walked out and left the room. Apparently, the issue was they were just friends, and he lived in another state with his wife and kids. Another woman had an affair with her cousin's husband and got pregnant, calling him her fiancé. Her husband died during this period, and it prompted her to go out and sleep with a few other one-night stands. At this point, she was exploring other alternatives, but was turned away because she was overweight and hypertensive, making the procedure too risky. She never followed up with the doctor and gained weight to over 400 pounds. It was too late for any other options at this point, and she'd been taking medication for the hypertensive thing, and the medication can cause death or deformities. When she delivered, it took the entire staff to prevent her from having a stroke. And the baby's kidneys, do they work? No one knows. Most of the stories are that the man cheated. If the mother cheats, there's no real reason to bring it up, so they don't really know. Lots of telling a mother who has only slept with one man that she and her baby have chlamydia. No weird stories of white babies to black parents or vice versa. I had a friend who was a nurse tell me this story. A birth of a couple's third child. The couple was white. The baby was obviously of Pacific Islander descent. Everyone went very quiet. The nurse telling me the story said she took a moment of silence as she realized what had happened. Then she tried to act normally, but waiting for the outburst. She said the tension was unreal. The guy stared for a minute at the child that was obviously not his. The mom was already in tears and talking very fast. The guy stood up, looked around for a minute, then left the room. Never said a word. He wasn't seen again at the hospital. The mom spent the rest of the day on her phone. The nurse doesn't think she ever found him. I got a weird one. My previous neighbor was a nurse and delivered one where my buddy of mine was involved. A buddy of mine she knew came in with his girlfriend who was in labor. My buddy was clearly not keen on having a kid, but the mother wanted to go through with it and was madly in love with my buddy to a point that it was obsession. So the girlfriend decided to keep it in order to keep him around. The girlfriend was properly paranoid, delusional, and an abusive head case that made my buddy's life hell for 18 months. He was at the point where I genuinely thought he might just run away or slip into depression because of this woman. She insisted it was his and was expecting him to either marry her or, in her words to one of my mutual friends, "If he won't love me, I'll just take him for all his money for the next 18 years. My neighbor said he looked like death in the waiting room while the baby was being delivered. The baby comes out, my buddy and the girl, who are both English-Irish heritage, looked and saw a Pacific Islander baby. Turns out the girlfriend was sleeping with one of the local rugby players on the down low, and he ended up knocking her up. My neighbor said she had never seen someone who looked so emotionally and mentally broken do such a 180 in less than a minute. My neighbor looked back at him as he walked out of the room laughing maniacally with joy. He looked at my neighbor and said, "That's not mine. Thank heck, I'm free." She said he was spotted dancing down the hallway to the exit. My buddy's doing okay now. He has a very nice South African girlfriend who he's been with for 3 years. They're looking to buy a house together and get married soon. His ex is now living with her parents in a small granny shack with the kid. The Pacific Islander baby daddy went MIA, and last I heard is suspected to be hiding out on some island in his native Fiji. Can't blame the guy for leaving, and I personally hope he's never found. Hospital social worker here. I met with a family because their baby was in the ICU for inhaling his monicum during birth, and we met with all NICU families for support. The father asked me in front of their 5 other children who were old enough to understand the question, how to get a paternity test. Awkward. I don't know about the delivery part necessarily, but the birth certificate part can be awkward. In Louisiana, if you're married or have been divorced for less than 300 days, the husband/ex-husband goes on the birth certificate unless there's a DNA test proving who the father is with a form signed by the mother, the husband, and the actual father. Many divorced women don't realize that and have a baby with someone else. It's a shock to find out legally, your ex-husband is still the baby's father unless you get all that other stuff sorted. Midwife from Australia here. Craziest delivery I ever attended was a girl who was pregnant 17 times with 15 live children as a result of those pregnancies. And 3 different dads turned up over the short course of her labor with baby number 15. They proceeded to have a fist fight about who was the real father, and I had to call security to escort them out. That followed with a call to child services. My wife is a nurse. One day, she had a woman come in complaining of abdominal pain. They quickly find out she's pregnant and in labor. Her wife arrives shortly after with a lot of questions. This is my granddad's story. He was a gyno. It must have been in the 70s when a married white couple came into the hospital with a woman in labor. Baby's born, my granddad is called to cut the cord. But the baby's all gray. The nurse is in terror and holds the baby upside down and smacks it on the butt, as was custom to clear the airways, and is almost in tears. Doctor, the baby's only getting darker and darker. I don't think it's getting enough oxygen. My granddad, having worked in the field for a long time at that point, just started smiling, took the baby and said, I think a good bath will do just fine, and proceeded to wash all the blood and fluids from birth off the baby, revealing a healthy and half-black child. He used to tell that story all the time when I was a kid. He said the husband just stormed out and it was a huge scandal in their village. Since it was Germany in the 70s in a rural area, there weren't that many candidates for the father either. Well, somehow, I don't know why, the husbands are almost always first aggressive towards the doctor or nurse who presents the baby. Had a case I will always remember. My first shift in gynecology. Late night, around 11 p.m. A woman comes in, screaming and cursing like there's no tomorrow. We check her and she's around 7 centimeters dilated. At 10, you can start the birth. We rush her to the birth room. Father's being led into the waiting room, which is also a library for new fathers. A lot of books with information on firstborns and things like that. Fast forward. Woman gives birth, she goes to the recuperating room, husband goes to her, both eagerly awaiting for the baby to be presented. My boss, who's one sadistic guy, hands me the baby and tells me to go present it. Did I forget to mention that the baby was black? Oh, and the mother was a snow white skinned redhead, and the father, well, blue eyes and blonde hair. There was absolutely no way that I could justify that amount of meddling. I bite the bullet, take the little lad, and head off. I enter the room. The father's standing up, he sees that the baby is black. He looks at his wife, looks at the baby, looks at my face. My face tells him, yes, there's no mistake here. And he loses it. Weirdly enough, his anger is not focused on the wife, but on me and the baby, the 2 unlucky bastards who had nothing to do with the betrayal or any of that. The husband starts throwing newspapers and books at me and the baby, shouting, "Get him away, that's a mistake." Not in a racist way or anything, just the man was in shock, and kept backing up towards the wall like a cornered animal trying to run away from a predator. In this case, he was just cornered by a dreadful fact, the one that he's not the father. Me and the baby managed to escape with just a bruise on my forehead. Bibles travel faster than any other books through air. When have you seen the real world hit a spoiled brat? When the high school principal's daughter, who previously got away with all kinds of garbage behavior, vandalism, drinking, major bullying, got caught vandalizing a lecture hall in uni, she was unceremoniously dumped and banned. Parents whined for months on Facebook about their poor baby's unfair treatment and the fact that her applications to other unis were being denied. Spending $50 on food a day is not normal. College girl got cut off from her parents for drinking and not going to class and had to get a job. She put on Facebook about how she's gonna go hungry and needs money. People offered her food and to make her dinner. She said, "That's okay, I just need about $40 to get through the day. I don't like to grocery shop." If you're wondering how she went through that much a day, she always ate out at a restaurant and had Starbucks twice a day. Add in snacks and alcohol and there's $40 in one day. I was a school bus driver in the 70s, during height of court-ordered busing, so I ferried poor kids to the rich side of town, then rich kids the other way. Lots of entitled brats, but one stands out. Super entitled kid, constantly defying rules. Eventually, I caught him with too many witnesses attempting to set a bus seat on fire with his lighter. School officials were called. Hearing with officials enrich Dad, and he's banned from all buses for the rest of the semester. Dad offers to pay for the damage and quietly accepts the punishment. Then comes the surprise. Next morning when I arrive at 6 a.m. to clean my bus, regular task every morning, Rich Kid and Dad are standing there. Dad introduces me to my new personal bus cleaner for the rest of the year. He brings the kid every morning and forces him to wash and clean the floors of my bus before taking him to school. By the end of the year, Entitled Kid is actually working hard and being friendly. We're getting along pretty well, and I help him out sometimes so he can get on to school. Kid turned out okay when all was said and done. Good move by Dad. Back in engineering school, one of my classmates was the son of one of our professors. Now, this professor was a really nice dude. He paid attention to his students, his classes were fun, and he rarely failed anyone. His son, on the other hand, was a total jerk. Rude and nasty, and would always brag about how his dad was a highly senior professor with tenure.
You know who my dad is, right?
Was literally his catchphrase. He wasn't even a good student. We ranked GPAs out of 10, and he was a 4. This professor actually taught a very specialized course, so we only had about 2 courses from him in our entire time at the school. This course in our 5th semester was a bit complicated. If you didn't do regular study, it was easy to fail, but if you practiced the stuff, passing was a breeze. So finals come around and Jerkface is out there bragging that he didn't need to study because his dad will pass him anyway. He took his confidence all the way to the exam hall. And then the results were out. He had scored 7 out of 100. We know because the professor called us all to the classroom and displayed his answer sheet on the projector. According to him, he was the 3rd student who had failed in his 20-year teaching career. And he couldn't be more disappointed that it was his son. The amount of verbal butt-whooping Jerkface received was enough to have him quivering like a wet cat in front of everyone. The next time he pulled the "Do you know who my dad is?" card, the standard answer he received was "the one who failed you." He pretty soon stopped after that. He retook the exam the following year, failed again, and had to drop out. Wherever he is today, I hope he learned his lesson. When I was working at a public library, we had a few local celebrities come in from time to time. Most of them were nice, but one had a real stick up his butt. He would complain about having to stand in line, about late fees, and about everything else. We would just say, "Sorry, those are the rules," or "Thank you for being patient," even though he wasn't. One day, he and I were apparently both having a bad day, and when I told him there was a limit on how many DVDs or video games he could check out at a time, he slammed his hands down on the desk and raged.
Do you know who I am?
This is a grown man, mind you. I was a little college student who barely looked old enough to drive. I was sick of his low-key bullying, so I just looked at him and said, "Yes, I do, Mr. X, and the rules still apply to you. Which of these would you like me to put back?" He was stunned. I don't think anyone had ever actually told him that the rules for everyone else did in fact apply to him as well. He was a little nicer after that. Not a lot nicer, but still. Video of a drunk college kid yelling at the cafeteria manager because he wanted bacon jalapeno mac and cheese. He hurls verbal abuse, pushes the manager, gets taken to the ground, and realizes his mistake when the cops show up. Him saying, "I'm so screwed," while being cuffed is super satisfying. When my brother was in school, he was horrifically bullied for being autistic, and his bully was the most entitled little brat I've ever had the displeasure of meeting. His father paid for boxing practice, karate lessons, and other martial arts. This made him think that he was the best at anything physical. My brother isn't overly fond of sports and prefers to read in the library. As the typical nerdy kid, he's a prime target for bullies. One day when the bully had cornered my brother up against a wall, my brother finally decided he wasn't just going to take it anymore. But he strongly dislikes violence and thus would not be fighting back. Instead, when my bully tried to punch him, my brother ducked. 3 broken fingers and a trip to the hospital later, the bully's father finds out what's been happening. All his extra classes and training were cancelled. He had all of his electronics and games sold, and if he wanted to have a car, he would have to work for every penny himself. A kid in college was a roommate of mine. He was always bratty and spoiled, but hung out with us as if he were a good friend, and we let him chill with us because sometimes he wasn't bad. Then one day we heard him arguing with his mom on the phone that he needed more money. From the ensuing argument, we learned that he had, in less than 1 year, burned through 30 grand that his parents had given him for food and discretionary spending. Mind you, he was not paying for tuition, or lodging, or his car with this money. It was basically just food money, as all those other other things were already covered by his parents. He was calling his mother some really nasty things and hung up on her. Then his father called and they got in an argument, cussing each other out. At the end of that call, he threw his iPhone at the wall and shattered it. This was the original iPhone. Turns out they cut him off, and he basically had to drop out of school and drive back home out of state because he couldn't afford to do anything anymore, and of course was too good to work a plebs job. He added me on Facebook about a year later and was a late blooming 9/11 truther. Obama was president by this time, and the only thing I ever said to him on Facebook was a simple reply correcting one fact that he was wrong about in his 9/11 conspiracy theory. He then posted 4 replies in quick succession telling me to open my eyes and then blocked me. Seems like maybe he didn't learn his lesson. Simple and pure example for my part. There was only one coffee shop on my campus, operating out of the library building, and it was always crowded. So you pretty quickly learned that if you wanted coffee before class, you got there 20 minutes early, grabbed a newspaper, I'm old, sue me, and took your time. It was always funny watching incoming freshmen crowd the line 5 minutes before their 8 a.m. and slowly filter out in despair as they realized there was absolutely no way that they were reaching that sweet Sumatra nirvana in time. Cue this little freshman girl, dressed in classic campus t-shirt, jean shorts, blonde ponytail coming out of the ball cap starter pack, walking up, assessing the line stretching out the door, and boldly deciding to just sorta skip it. Now, the baristas were usually pretty cool with people skipping for simple things, dropping down a quarter for some Scantrons or $1 for a cookie, anything that didn't require interaction. Not this girl. She caught the barista's attention while the previous customer was still paying and went, "Hi, yeah, can I get a latte please? Like really quickly?" The line starts back there," replied the now slightly confused girl behind the counter. "But I have class," whined the freshman. There was an awkward pause before the barista responded, "You're on a college campus. Are you freaking serious? Why do you think all these people are here? Back of the line." "Oh," was the only thing the freshman girl thought to say. As she turned to look at a line full of people staring daggers back at her, she looked not upset or embarrassed, but sort of enraptured with this newfound understanding that she's just been imparted. It's like for the first time in her life, she realized that other people were in her way for reasons. It was actually kind of beautiful to watch, like a baby deer learning to walk for the first time. Better late than never. One of my favorite things about the military is that in a uniform, nobody can tell how privileged or unprivileged you might have been. It's a total blank slate, and for many, it's humbling to not get to / have to wear your social status on your sleeve. On my second ship, there was an E2 who grew up very wealthy and was a jerk about it. He wasn't afraid to let us know. He thought that he was better than his peers. There's a stereotype of the enlisted guy who thinks of himself as an officer, as a way to pretend that means anything. That's this guy in every way. And he would try to get out of crappy enlisted work because he was going to be an officer, probably even a commanding officer of a ship. So there we were, a few hours into his first deployment, and this jerk gets violently seasick. It lasted for days. I don't know if you've ever been around someone who can't open their eyes without yakking, but it's awful. You really feel bad for them. It's hard to watch someone go through. Not with this guy. I'll admit that I was a bit spoiled growing up, though I didn't think I was a brat. My mom had a maid that came in several times a week. When I went to college, several things were very different for me. I knew how to clean up after myself, but cleaning a bathroom was completely new. The biggest shock was laundry. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing or how. I knew I was supposed to use detergent and softener, but I thought any soap would do, and didn't know what softener was. I had no idea how or when to add them either. Reality hit when a campus security guard came in and I asked how much of the dish soap I was supposed to use, and the man started laughing. He did help me get the right soap after and explained how to operate a washer dryer. I used to repair trails for the Forest Service, and I wouldn't call anybody a brat necessarily, but we're all pretty spoiled when it comes to manual labor and sleeping on the ground. On day 1, the bush plane flies the crew out to a grass airstrip about 40 miles east of town. Then you shoulder your pack, grab an axe and a shovel, and start hiking up the canyon, usually in the rain. Until you watch that plane disappear over the ridge, it's hard to imagine what you've signed up for. Hard labor all day, every day. Working, cooking, and camping in the rain that whole first month. No phone, no mail, no roof. And if you forgot something, you'll just have to live without it until the road opens in July. Wolves and mountain lions circle the camp at night. Sometimes bears come for your food. Everybody struggles for the first month. You'd see the kid who'd been the hard guy on his high school football team start to sit through lunch with his head in his hands just licked. Guys who are in the 1,000-pound club at their gym slumped up against a tree all evening, eating peanut butter for dinner because they were too beat to cook. Demanding as the job was, it wasn't really a physical issue. The best workers on the crew were hippie Jesus types with noodle arms who read Marcus Aurelius around the campfire at night. They just took everything as it came because no matter what, it just kept coming. Them and the Mormon ranch kids. I don't know how those kids came up, but nothing brought them down. In high school, one guy was a real jerk to everyone, and he had no sense of anyone but himself, and everyone kissed his butt because he was not only valedictorian of his class, but also star football, basketball, tennis, and track star. He was top dog for all the extracurriculars as well. He made my best friend cry multiple times just being a jerk towards her, and she had the unfortunate luck of being in his grade. He was also known as a player, just dating whoever he felt was hot enough for him, but would also put out for him. He honestly thought that nothing bad could ever happen to him because he was just that special. He graduated high school and went to his school of choice and immediately came out as gay on social media. Not long after that, he got his first boyfriend. Before the semester was even finished, his boyfriend cheated on him and he flunked out of his college and ended up having to go to another school. Last time I saw him, he was super polite and seemed to be rather humbled by his experience outside of our tiny town. I was out at a farm with my cousins for a party. It was more like an afternoon barbecue with all the parents sat talking and cooking while the kids ran around playing. Usual lazy afternoon in Africa. So anyway, I was 16 at the time, making me the oldest of the kids, and I'll admit that I was all back of the bus, too cool for school type of cringy teenager, and was practicing my casual aloofness. Now, there was this German couple there with this absolute monster child of 5 years old who made it his mission to terrorize all the other kids. The parents of this little Adolf sat beaming with delight watching their little ray of sunshine play with other children. Eventually, it became apparent that they were not going to do anything about it, and my parents told me to keep my cool and just ignore him, which I did because I didn't want to put my parents in an awkward situation. At some point in the afternoon, the kid found one of those plastic toddler toys. You know the ones where they can sit on it and push themselves around, but it also has a handle at the back that toddlers can use as a walker. So he finds this toy and is running around the lawn full speed, ramming all the other kids. Now, I did tell him nicely that it was not good to hurt the other little boys and girls, but he just straight up ignored me and carried on with his game, giggling and chasing the other kids. He also decided that I was now fair game and I got rammed in the ankles and Achilles tendon a few times, and I'm fuming. His parents were watching and laughing the whole time. Eventually, I'm done with this little jerk, so I position myself in front of this small ditch, only about a quarter-inch deep and full of grass, and pull out my phone pretending to read messages. I was making myself an easy target for the little brat. He comes charging up behind me, aiming for my heels again. The front wheels go into the little ditch, stomping the walker. The kid was pushing it so fast that his momentum carried him right over the handlebars, right over the push toy, and past me, face planting into the dirt, going full scorpion. There was no blood, but he lay there screaming. The best part was that the parents watched the whole thing take place, and they and the other parents never suspected that I stood in that exact spot for that exact reason. His parents were kind of peeved that the kid hurt himself while I was watching the kids, but they couldn't say anything, so they just kept the boy close the rest of the day. So this story isn't about a child. This was a full-grown woman, maybe mid-30s, who very clearly was handed everything in life. Spoiled, selfish, entitled, whatever you want to call it, she was way out of touch with reality. So I grew up in a very nice upper middle class area with nothing but houses for miles around. At the center is a small block with a little grocery store, a few boutiques, restaurants, and a drugstore. It being the only shopping center anywhere around tends to attract really snobby people. Anyway, I was maybe 14 or 15 and went to the drugstore to grab something or other and happened to wander past the makeup aisle. This drugstore is pretty large, so their makeup selection is huge, with every brand you can think of taking up one whole wall of the building. I had just rounded the corner where I saw this woman sitting on the ground just as I saw the manager coming around the opposite corner, making a beeline for her like a bulldog. He stops, arms crossed, and the following happens.
Ma'am, I hope you know you're going to have to pay for those.
What?
The makeup. All of these packages you've opened, you're going to have to pay for them.
He gestured about towards where I was standing, still at the end of the aisle. I looked down to my right and saw what he was pointing at, the pressed powder compacts. She'd opened one of each shade, ranging from ivory to warm beige, and left the remains in piles at the bottom of each display. That's right, I said each. She went through every single brand and opened the packaged components. And to make it worse, each brand usually makes more than one type of pressed powder. There had to have been at least 40 of them. Her, agitated, "What do you mean? I don't understand. Why do I have to pay for them when I only need one?" Him, having a stroke,
"Because you've destroyed them. And because you've used them. We can no longer sell those to anyone else because they've been contaminated by you."
Her, becoming irate, "Well, I needed to test them to match my skin tone." It was at this point I realized that next to all the compacts were the used makeup sponges that come with them, as well as what appeared to be used baby wipes. Him, with an impending aneurysm,
"Well, I hope it was worth all the money you now owe us."
This was about 15 years ago, so the remainder of the conversation is fuzzy. I know she was panic crying and was refusing to pay, and he was threatening to call the cops. But I had to leave at that point, so I didn't get to see the outcome. But I do know that I did a little math when I got home. Nowadays, one of those compacts will cost about $10 each, but back then I'd say 5 to 6. So she had to pay at least $240 at the end of that. My friend is this entitled younger brother who acts like the world revolves around him. While his dad is stern with him, his mom babies this behavior, and he can get away scot-free with almost anything. He gets angry very easily, and even at the slightest things. I was over at my friend's house, and while we were downstairs, we heard a loud crash from his brother's room. It turns out he was playing Fortnite on his TV and threw the controller into the glass table, which shattered. My friend called me later in the day over Discord and told me how after his dad came back, he grounded his brother for a month, and he wasn't allowed to play video games or go over to a friend's house. He had to pay for a new table with his allowance and had to do chores. He got what he deserved. Went on a double date with my boyfriend, his friend, and his friend's date. The whole evening she was rude, snobby, and overall a demanding person that felt entitled to whatever she wanted. She was rude to the waitstaff and suggested we tip them nothing for refusing to refund her order after she ate the whole thing and complained about everything. On the car ride back, she started driving, then halfway through the drive announced she didn't want to drive anymore. The rest of us had been drinking, so we all refused to take over. She said, "Fine, but I'm not driving either." Let go of the steering wheel and slammed on the brakes. We got rear-ended and it was her car, so no cost to the rest of us. But it was instant karma for her behavior and attitude. When I was in high school, there was this horribly bratty rich kid who loved to pick on others, push people around, and play the "do you know who my dad is" card a lot. Let's call him Todd. I hated this kid all through school. Final year of high school, I'd had a bad day one day, and it obviously showed. Todd sees me walking in the hall and makes some snide remark about my shirt. I promptly tell him to shove it as I'm not in the mood. He walks over to me while I'm at my locker and slams my locker door and shoves me. I recall that he said something else, but I honestly don't remember what it was. I just remember that I saw red and drove my fist into his nose like a truck. I stomped away all teenage and angsty. Got called to the office the next day. Todd is sitting there with his father and the principal. I knew I was screwed. The principal shows us all the security camera footage of what went down. I'm assuming an expulsion is coming my way when Todd's father puts his hand on my shoulder and smiles. He tells Todd to say thank you, and we both look at him dumbfounded. "Why would I say thank you? He broke my nose," says Todd. And his father responds with,
"Because if I had been there and seen you act like that, I'd have killed you."
He stood up and left, and I was excused to return to class. Todd never bothered me again. My former roommate's sister got slapped pretty hard. She knew absolutely nothing of the real world. Couldn't do laundry, cook food, clean, nothing. Her mom paid her share of the rent and she didn't even have to work while she was going to college and staying under our roof. She had the perfect setup. She was so dense, she kept her social security card in her wallet and it was stolen the first day she moved to the big city. Even though she was warned. But oh, she knew better. Later on, she decided she didn't like living with us and our rules, such as because you can't let your friends live in our apartment. It's against the lease. If your friends are gonna come over and make a big mess and eat all the food in the house that we pay for, we need compensation. We're fresh from college, low-income wage earners at the time. We can't afford it. And she needed to be respectful of quiet hours and clean up after herself. So she decided to make her daddy move her out so she could move in with a diagnosed schizophrenic who refused to take her meds and was a hoarder. Her mother and father said, if you move out, we won't support you. She did it anyway. Oh, how she complained and moaned. I had to get a job at Burgerville. The people there stole my paycheck from my wallet because I kept all of my paycheck in cash in it. We can't afford internet. It's so expensive. Food is so expensive. Well, she ended up quitting school and moving back in with her mom. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, linked at the top of the description. And if you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot, linked in the description as well. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.